Okay, everybody, welcome class and everybody listening or watching. Um, we have another Friends of the Class visit with Ryan Pagella from the Mutant Ages and his YouTube channel, Ryan Pagella Theme Parks and Adventures. And this is an interview and a visit I've been looking forward to for a very long time because a few months ago, I had started listening to a podcast called Disology. And as you know, Disology has been on this podcast and in the class as well. But the first episode I listened to had Ryan as guest, and they were talking about coding and queer coding in Disney movies, and specifically in the Disney Pixar release Luca. And so I've been looking forward to this conversation since then. And so I finally reached out and said, "Hey, I would love to have you talk. Here's what I want to talk about. If this is something you talk about too much and you're bored with it, let me know." He was more than willing to share his time talking about this. So we'll get into several topics. And so that it's enough from me, I want to welcome Ryan to the show. And as a way of welcome, could you just give us a little bit of background as to your fandom, how you were introduced to Disney and Marvel and everything, and then just take us up through today with your fandom?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I've become a big fan since Rachel and Samantha were on for Disology, and I really like the educational aspect of all this and just the deep dives you do here. So
Thank you.
I'm excited to be here. And I've been a Disney Marvel fan for a very long time. And I guess I don't know how I can shorten this, but I'll do my best. So obviously, like most of us from our age bracket of the early 80s kids, we grew up with the Renaissance movies of
Mhm.
Disney. So we're talking like Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, Lion King, and I was obsessed with all of them. And I loved Disney, and it's like all I listened to. I didn't really listen to real music for a very long time because I just listened to Disney soundtracks. Um, and then in my teens, I kind of actually strayed away from Disney for a long time,
Mhm.
despite being as obsessed with it as I was, because at that point I had discovered the X-Men, which is what the Mutant Ages is about, and just comic books in general. And so I got really into that. It kind of seemed like the natural evolution for something a little bit more grittier for me at that time in my teens. Although I do feel that Disney is very layered in the same way that Marvel is as an adult, and I can
Mhm.
understand that now. And I had read X-Men growing up as well, just like in the background, but it just spoke to me in a way that nothing else was. And to this day, there are not a lot of comparable pieces of media that the X-Men stand for in terms of just a superhero team that's about marginalization. And as a then closeted gay child, I just really hooked onto it. So I got really into Marvel for a very long time. Um, and then I was sort of like dabbling in theme parks because we were teenagers. We were always going to the Six Flags in Massachusetts. And I got really into that because they also had DC
Mhm.
heroes and the Six Flags. And we went there when they had just installed the Superman, which at the time was the first of its kind, where it was one of those steel coasters
Yeah.
that has a very large drop and was moving at 85 miles per hour. It hadn't been done before. There are bigger, better coasters now, but it was revolutionary at the time, and people from all over the world were coming. So we spent a lot of time hanging out at Six Flags, seeing the Batman stunt show, meeting the DC characters, even though we were Marvel nerds. And I just really loved rides and the theming of it. And then I think it was 2004, I finally went to Disney World
Okay.
because my family, we weren't one of those families that traveled. We took vacations here in Massachusetts on the coast in Cape Cod, and we'd rent a house for the summer, and that was vacation for my parents. That's what they like. And even now they still go to Jamaica and wherever they want to go in Florida. They are just beach people. Um, and so my first experience at Disney World was just, it was a monumental moment for me because I was 19. That was the first
Mhm.
time I got to go. So I got to appreciate it in a different lens than going as a child where it's nostalgic. It wasn't nostalgic for me. It was sort of this buildup of everything I had grown up with. And I got really emotional about it. Me and my older sister, my younger sister was enjoying it, but not as into it as this me and my older sister were. We were like crying over the fireworks over the
Yeah.
Magic Kingdom. And we did the double feature too. So we did like 5 days in the parks and then we went on the cruise for another
Yeah.
3 days. So like we really did the full thing. And when it came back to all my friends, I was like, I forgot how much I loved Disney and immediately got re-engrossed with it. And just since then, everything has been sort of about Disney and Marvel comics for me. Obviously, I've dabbled in many, many fandoms. I used to work for a convention for 10 years and eventually run the convention. So, I know lots about nerd
Mhm.
culture and pop culture. Um, and, theme parks is like my thing. I love theme parks so much. And so since then, I've just been going to Disney a bunch up until 2020 happened. Although I did go in the fall of 2021 and I just went there a few months ago and I'm
Okay.
trying to move there so I can have it all the time. But we spent a lot of time just diving into Marvel Comics, X-Men, and Disney, and its influence on the world and what they produce. And here in the LGBTQ community, we love Disney so much, and it would be not honest to say that so many of us even work at Disney World because we
Mhm.
do. Uh, but one of the things is that we don't have the representation that we're looking for out of it, and so we kind of grab onto what we can, and we still love Disney anyway. And I think right now it's funny that you're bringing me on the show because right now Disney is at war with the state of Florida
Yeah.
over this, and for the first time ever, have they said anything at all that has addressed us as a community. And it's been haphazard at best. It's been kind of messy, and they could have been handled a lot better. But it's happening, and it's
Mhm.
affecting even what's being produced in Disney. Lightyear just had an openly
Mhm.
queer character in it, and so I mean, we're not fully there yet, but we're going in the direction we want to go. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I love myself some Disney like everybody
Yeah.
else does. And I love theme parks. So this is what I do is obsessed with all these things 24/7 and that, be the nerd that I am and try and break apart the politics where I can. So I hope that was the shortened version I could have given you on that. But yeah.
No, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that background. And as far as Disney theme park fandom, I'm similar in that I did go a few times as a kid. Um, I like I remember I had pictures with actual Dreamfinder and Figment. Figment's always been my favorite character since then. Um, and but probably junior high and high school and into college, I didn't really go. 2012, we went back because I had a conference in Orlando.
Yep.
And so my wife and I, we were dating at the time, but she went with me. And we had 2 days of park passes, and I was trying to plan out what parks to visit. But we went at the end of October, and that was also the year that Superstorm Sandy came through.
Oh, wow.
So like the parks were completely empty. I mean, we went to all four parks, did everything
Wow.
we wanted to do. We didn't do like character meet and greets and a lot of shows and everything.
No, but I bet
Um,
those lines were beautiful.
yeah, we literally walked. This was before, this was when they still had the fast pass paper system.
Yeah, I kind of miss
Um,
it.
I yeah, we could talk about Genie Plus, and I have awkward feelings about Genie Plus, but I'm also hypocritical about it as well because I use it.
Yeah, same.
So, but yeah, I mean, we walked on to Pirates of the Caribbean
Wow.
and Jungle Cruise, and the
That's
first
a big wow.
line we actually waited for, I think we waited 5 minutes for Haunted Mansion. It was insane,
That's
and
nothing. I'm
so
impressed you were able to walk right on Jungle Cruise because
yeah,
that typically that and Tower of Terror have the longest lines just because
yeah,
they have to do such a long loadout on them.
yeah. And this last trip that we went November 2021. We actually that was the one ride we didn't do. We didn't do the Jungle Cruise because every time it was like over 2 hours.
But that
And
happened
I'm
to
like,
us. Yeah, I was just there in
yeah,
April. We're trying to go back in about a month if things work out. But same with Jungle Cruise. I was like, well, maybe if we get on there like right after fireworks, and they had to shut it down because they had like a 2 hour wait time
Yeah.
past the time they were closed. And I was like, I guess we're not going on the Jungle Cruise
Yeah.
this trip.
Yeah. But so thank you for the background on your Disney fandom and
Yeah, of
on your
course.
X-Men fandom. Um, and there were a couple of things in there that you said that I should have written down so I didn't forget, because you made some really interesting points about different things. But one thing I wanted to ask is, you said that Disney is so important to the queer community, and the fact that it has been very recent. They've had the, what did they call it, the Rainbow Collection, I think, for however many years, and they've had a parade at Disneyland Paris, but this year's the first year they actually, correct me if I'm wrong, called it the Pride Collection when they would
I don't.
sell.
I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna say that that is correct or right, but you're probably right that it is that. I just don't know it historically well
Yeah.
enough to say yes or no on that, and I don't want to be called out for that later. But you're right that it did happen,
Yeah.
and the representation for the LGBTQ community has been there sort of in its pockets, but it's right now it's at the forefront because of everything that's
Yeah.
happening. And you're right that Disney is really important to us in the queer community because again, we all grew up with it. Many of us are theater kids, so it was very easy to relate to characters in Disney. And we all love the Disney villains. Um, you know, there's many people I know who work for Disney who are also queer to some
Mhm.
degree. And I think it's just how the business works because especially when you work in a creative environment, that happens a lot. Um, and so it's just always been important to us. And so what's been most important to us is seeing them do anything politically at all, just because they are such a large platform.
Mhm.
And, actually, I was working a different job last year when they started toying with this idea in Florida with their quote unquote "Don't Say Gay" bill, which is not what it's actually called, but it's what's been dubbed at this point. And Disney didn't say anything for a while, and
Mhm.
I was just like, this job I was working for was based in Orlando, and I was like, they people I was working with in Orlando was like, Disney has to say
Yeah.
something because, and this is the representation that we've always been hoping that we'd get at Disney because they're just such a big platform, as is Marvel or any other entity that is providing media that the general consumer is
Mhm.
like taking in on a regular basis. And with Disney, like they have a reach to the whole world. So like, and I think this is also partially why they're very hesitant and very apprehensive about making like a queer princess or like
Mhm.
a superhero or one of their leads be actually queer in some shape or form, is because they're afraid of the backlash that they will get because they're one of the largest corporations and they don't know which investors will pull out.
Yeah.
Or I know there's been lots of differences with China in terms of what films can even get shown over there. And a lot of the Marvel films are suddenly getting banned because of the representation that is barely even being
Yeah.
shoot into the Marvel movies right now. And so it's important to us that Disney says something because we all want to be part of Disney. Like we want to go be part of their shows. We want to go work their parks. We love their movies. Like we are their people and we're
Yeah.
there to work for them. And many of us for minimum wage just so we can do it. And it's always been a struggle to get Disney to represent us. Although in the past couple of years, even in the parks, just seeing um pride represented at all has been just like a huge difference. And I know it's still not enough, but coming from when I first went in 2004 when I was
Mhm.
19 to the past few years when I've been going and seeing big pride flags and seeing couples like holding hands, same-sex
Mhm.
couples, which was not happening when I was going there in 2004. Seeing that their Lego set and their Lego store at Disney Springs had a pride set. It's a very different feeling where I'm like, there's progress happening.
Yeah.
It's slow progress, and sometimes we go backward and forward again, but it's happening, and it's just very important to us.
Yeah.
So
Well, and that's the question I have, is that if, and we're going to get into coding and queer coding and everything in just a bit, but regarding representation,
Yeah.
I mean, like this last semester of the class was very interesting because there was the internal struggles going on with, the stories that come out about Bob Chapek and Bob Iger, and then there were the
Yeah.
stories with the Florida politics and like kind of like this weird culture war and
Exactly.
um but one thing I kept thinking is, as far as representation, is it someone in your position, do you feel like it's enough to go step by step and the progress step by step? Should they be doing more? Or is it, are you understanding that this is why it is step by step? It's taking this long. And then like the kind of the fourth scenario is like, does it like should they be so worried about the image? Because
Yeah.
like they just should, they their fifth pillar now is inclusion. Should they say, what, we're not worried about the image, we're not worried about what people are going to say, we are inclusive to everybody, and here's where we're going. And so like I guess I'm asking, is there some like understanding, celebration, or frustration? Like where does all that fall?
Well, I think the first answer I'm going to have is, what do we even determine as step by step? Who
Hmm.
determines that? What are the steps? What are these figmented steps that we're looking at? And the answer is good. This is funny because this is what the Mutant Ages is all about: is all the different perspectives on how you take uh, rights, and we're going to fight for our rights, and what is the right way to do it, and what's the incorrect way. And we can get into that when we get into that. But right now, for Disney itself, you're right that sometimes that it's a very slow progress. But in terms of inclusion, we they vary. They go forward and they'll suddenly have a bunch of characters of color, which is fantastic, and we're seeing a lot more of that and a lot more accurate representations of culture around the world in their films. I do think that they have very positively started to turn things around on what they're putting out there. Moana and Kanto are two that come to mind that I
Hmm.
thought were just very far more respectful to the source material and those cultures than previous movies had done. And I mean, like, you go back to Peter Pan, which
Yeah.
is just,
Yeah.
it is like such a problematic movie in so many ways. It's funny because it's your background right
Yeah.
now.
Well,
Um,
they've actually changed the cube to reflect that also.
yeah, and
The
and
the
that's what
the
I mean.
map. They've
And
changed the map that's inside the cube.
and interestingly enough, with Disney, it's they have their films, which could do a lot more about representation, not only for the queer community, but for like any community, whether it's Black, Muslim, Asian, whatever. uh it Yeah, even the trans community, like, they could be doing a lot more with that in their films. But the parks are so much faster to reflect this right now
Hmm.
than the movies are, where they are changing things in the queue. There was that whole backlash about Splash Mountain and its
Hmm.
history and how racist it was. And they're like, well, why don't we spin it to Princess and the Frog, because that's what people were saying. They're like, what if we make it about this instead, because Tiana is a much more positive representation than whatever was happening and zippity doo dah. And I do think they want to make the progress, and they'll make these big leaps, and then they won't do anything for a while because they've made a big leap and they're waiting to see how people are going to react to it. With the parks, more or less, there aren't huge reactions. Although there was
Hmm.
one guy who got very upset that people with tattoos were allowed to work at the park, and
Yeah.
it was losing the immersion for him. And that was just its own, whenever I see anything like this, it always brings me back to mental health. And like, as I said before we started recording, I've been taking all these mental health classes and understanding how it works for my own sake, but also just so I can put that positivity into my YouTube channel. And when people have those strong reactions, especially if we do something that's queer in a Disney film and somebody claims they're pushing the gay agenda, it's like there's something about that person that they haven't figured out. I'm not saying that they are queer, although that's like my favorite answer to give. Uh, but really, it's all about like what's going on inside their minds that is making them this abrasive in the first place. And it's usually, it has nothing to do with that. It just becomes a target. But yeah, I think Disney. I don't know if there's steps, and that's what going back to my original point, I don't think there's ever going to be steps we can take.
Okay.
And I think we just have to keep trying things and hoping that it sticks and that Disney eventually decides that, hey, we're going to represent this and not be afraid of what the backlash is going to be. And I think at some point we will get to that. Because other sources of media have gotten a lot more bold about that recently. I think a lot about Nickelodeon and how they were one of the first first companies to really start featuring queer characters in their cartoons and animation, and that was a huge deal. And I want to see Disney do the same. I want to see them to get past the or find the courage to not be afraid of showing that representation, because it's not all white straight people. And I always think about Stonewall and what happened there, and like I don't want that to happen with Disney. I don't think we need that level of war happening. Although who knows what's going to happen in Florida at this point. But I think if they start representing, I think that's a huge step. And they're very close with some of their characters that are already queer coded. They used to be villains, but they have some heroes now that are very queer coded, and we're cleaning on to that. We're like, please, because they used to queer code all their villains, which is craziness, and I love them. But again, we haven't had, when they realized they were doing that, they were like, okay, we're not going to queer code our villains. We're not going to have these villains that represent gay characters without saying they're gay, and have them also all be the villains. So we realize that's wrong, so we're going to stop doing that. But they haven't given us anything else. It's not like, okay, well, are you going to give us a queer character that is not a villain? And I was talking to my co-host about this yesterday before I came on to this podcast. I mean, I wish she could have done it as well, because she offers some very useful insight. But the characters that we've always liked most within the X-Men, for example, are the ones that are both a hero or a villain, and that being a hero or a villain isn't a label anyone should really even have. Like, there shouldn't be like you're either one of these two things. It's the more interesting characters are the ones who are somewhere in between. Kind of like Ahsoka in Star Wars, where she's not quite Jedi and she's not quite Sith, because she realizes that both sides are kind of problematic. And like I Disney needs to figure this out, and I don't know how long it's going to take. But I think right now we are in a point where that they can do something that will make a difference. And they could make these big, bold leaps, or they could do something that is step by step, little steps. But anything at this point we're willing to take. I feel like that's generally what it comes down to, and I think we're heading in the right direction right now, which is really positive. And I do think that it needs to be more, but like all other struggles for equal rights, it takes time, and I wish it wasn't that way. It should not be that way, but it's unfortunately historical how it's been, at least in the past couple hundred years. So we'll get there. I don't know if that's an adequate answer. It's very long-winded, but it's a very challenging topic to discuss, because there is no right answer. Unless we could just get away from these assumptions that are assigned to gender or sexuality, or to gender roles, or just any of these assumptions that we put on people that are just stereotypes in the first place. And if we could just get rid of those, we would not have nearly as many issues as we do in our current challenges.
No, I mean, it's a great answer. Thank you for the response. It's like you said, it's a multifaceted issue. And for someone like me, like we communicated beforehand, I am not from that community, so like trying to understand more about it, it is so multifaceted. So yeah, I appreciate anything. Let's talk about the 1930 Hays Code.
Yes.
And so the 1930 Hays Code was in effect from 1930 to 1952 until the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Some of the things that the Hays Code looked for were like overly violent material,
Or
sexual persuasion,
yeah, perverse subjects
verse,
like
yeah,
homosexuality.
um,
Um,
and homosexuality fell into that.
yeah,
And so then that's where we get to coding, and that's where we get
yeah,
to queer coding, is the creators' attempts to represent and to kind of get around the Hays Code to include these in their products. So can you give us a background of what queer coding is,
sure.
and then give us a few examples of what queer coding is um like from the 30s to 1952, and then we'll talk about Disney in just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that easiest answer for here is to just explain like what it is visibly, and to say that I think it's difficult because we obviously were not alive then, so we don't know what it was like. But people being out of the closet back then was not really a thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like very, very rare. It's not like right now where I feel like so many people are coming out left and right, which is really fantastic. So you have to think about like these writers and authors and screenplay writers who are sitting down and trying to include these characters that are considered wrong and writing them into their stories, and they themselves may or may not have been queer to some degree but can never come out or even
Mm-hmm.
address those feelings. And so the way that they end up becoming portrayed in their stories is like in a negative manner. So oftentimes the characters that would express these codes were villains. And with, again, it comes back to what I said before where it was stereotypes. So we're talking about assigning gender roles and
Mm-hmm.
what considers you a man and what considers you a woman, basically. And that's a lot of what would happen with these characters. So a gay character being represented without being overly perverse or being um actually coming out as gay was to basically flip the gender roles around, and that is usually how you could tell, um which is not a very great way to be, because I think gender roles should not really exist in the first place. Just do whatever you want to do. But back in that time period, like male characters would be acting feminine, such as
Mm-hmm.
they'd be very vain, looking at themselves in the mirrors, doing their makeup, they would wear a dress instead of like like a suit or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They'd be very eccentric or flamboyant, very into fashion, and oftentimes like portrayed as lean, frail, or weak. And because that was just what we decided women were back then, which was
Okay.
absolutely incorrect. And then the flip side of that is that you would deal with female characters who would be presented as masculine, which is really not a real thing either. And they would be doing men's work, like they'd want to be doing construction or join the army, and they'd be fighters. They'd be putting on like men's clothing, like a suit with a tie, or they'd be very messy, dirty, unkempt, because men are considered that way, and they'd be into like men's hobbies, which back then, I mean, what does that even count as? If you looked at like the 80s, 90s, you could be like, yeah, sure, football, cars, whatever. And then despite this code saying that they don't want things to be perverse, many of these characters would be very hypersexual.
Okay.
And that's what it evolved into after the code was dismissed. And they continue to still incorporate those qualities and characters all the way up until like the mid 2000s. That's only a recent change historically. And so that's how you could always tell that these characters would be coded as gay, is because they were just playing on these gender roles, which, I mean, when you hear that saying gender is fake, it's not saying that no, like men and women don't exist, because that's not true either. It just means these roles that we've assigned to gender are not real.
Yeah.
It's something that we've assigned by our society, and it's something that's been flipped by writers to represent queer characters in stories before they were allowed to represent those characters. And I do find, going back to what I said earlier, with these writers that may have been queer themselves, but were never allowed to express that, and oftentimes probably put that somewhere in their mind where they just cut it off and said, no, I can't feel these feelings, so therefore I don't feel these feelings, would come out in a negative way, which is why we have so many villains that would turn out to be homosexual or queer, or like queer coded, because it's coming from a place that A, they can't be represented at all, B, society thinks homosexuality and queerness back then was very bad, and C, you have writers who probably were queer themselves and they couldn't express that or address their own feelings to themselves, so it was coming out in a very hateful or self-destructive way. And that is sort of what grew with queer coding. And there's a lot of gender studies and queer studies about this particular theory. And it's very interesting to just fall down the internet landslide of articles that have been written about this. And especially if you take something like Marvel or Disney and you go queer coding in these characters, you'll come up with like thousands of articles, because it is a subject that comes up frequently. And I'm trying to think of like a character from that time period that when the Hays Code was in effect, that would be a good example. But my history knowledge of like film during that time isn't super great. Unless you like want to go and look at Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty, who was just for a Disney character, she may not have fallen into the very masculine traits, but she also wasn't being presented as feminine. And she had a very like, masculine build, in the sense that she was hard lined. She had the big horns, and a very intense personality, and she was just very flat's not the right word I'm looking for, but very like, her demeanor was not presented as feminine, or whatever feminine was, and so that's why she was very villainous. And I don't remember what year. I'm doing some quick Googling here because I got to see what year Robin Hood came out. I think that was later. Yeah, it was the 70s. So that doesn't really count. But like, that's the kind of thing you're looking at. And so this happened frequently. And I do know that there was a lot of characters in old film, like that were shot on black and white cameras, like that were villainous or not considered serious. That would be like a man in a dress, for example. And that's another part of queer coding, is that a lot of queer characters, if they are not the villain, are presented as queer coding. So they're not outwardly queer. If they are not the villain, they are often a joke character. And sometimes and oftentimes would be combined into, well, the villain is just also a joke and he's gay. Because like, what could a queer person contribute to society other than trying to tear us down and also be comedy relief for us? Which it's just a very dangerous line to walk. And you should, and I know we're talking about queer coding, but when you make this assumption about any culture, it's a problem. Like, because then you immediately create this assumption for people to latch onto that is not true. And during 2020, we spent so much time in the Black Lives Matter movement that it really showed what happens when you make these assumptions. And just quickly kind of going back to, how the queer community would fight back against this, against with Disney and how you can band together the queer community. And like, I think it was at the beginning of this conversation where you're like, well, I'm not queer, so I don't know what it's like to walk that walk and know what it feels like. And I can't say, like, I'm not Black, so I don't know what it's like to walk that walk either. However, when you are in a marginalized class of some kind, so I'm queer, right? Like, I've already dealt with in my life losing opportunities or being treated differently, that being able to stand up for other communities that are being marginalized is something that I can understand because I've experienced it myself. And something we did in the LGBTQ community during 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement exploded, is that we just canceled Pride. We said we're not celebrating Pride this month for the LGBTQ community because it is important that we go stand with our brothers and sisters in the Black community. And so, I'm not saying that you can't do that, but or that you can't do it, but it just makes it easier for somebody who's marginalized to understand the struggle of somebody else who is also marginalized. And that's why you often see like that crossover. And also often why you see it in media as well, where you'll have a character of color or like um from a different culture also be working with like these goofy gay characters
Mhm.
because they're all positioned as bad. And in real life, we often work together. So it's just very interesting to go down that way. But there's also like the flip side of that too, where there's certain cultures that are not certain cultures, there's certain communities that refuse to help other communities or people from those communities just because they think that they are the more important problem that needs to be fixed or challenge that needs to be overcome. Um, but realistically, we're all fighting for equality. And
Yeah.
with queer coding, it's represented the same way in media as well, which we could talk about with Disney, because Disney has the most famous queer coded characters of all time, still to this day.
Yeah.
Like,
So before we get into specifically Disney, like one thing that I have always wondered, I can't say always wondered probably, but one thing I have wondered a lot is, yes, I'm not from that community. I am, uh, by appearance, I am in the class that I am in, right?
sure, right,
Um, and so, but I find that I support, I I believe heavily in inclusion.
yeah,
And but I also find like as myself, am I don't know how to say it. It's very inarticulate. Um, am I like am I going out of my way, or first, am I doing enough? But am I doing stuff to show that I'm inclusive? And is there a part, like I believe I'm trying to do that to be inclusive, but there's also I'm cognizant of, is there a part of me that's saying like, hey, everybody, look at me. Like, look
yeah,
at me. I'm from this privileged class and I'm trying to help and I'm trying to be supportive. And so it's this really weird feeling that that it's to have that, is it always altruistic, or is
yeah.
there some other motive in there? And I guess to kind of answer my question, I really believe that it's very difficult for true altruism to be present, because if you do something nice for somebody, you feel good about it. To me, that's like you get something from that.
Right.
You're not getting like a public acknowledgement maybe, but you've done something, so you get something from it. Um, so to be honest, Ryan, I'm not sure if I had a real question in there.
I know
Um,
you did though. You actually did. You were like, the question is, it was kind of like a question you ask yourself, and it's not a question I can answer for you. Is like, A, are you doing enough? And B, am I representing where I could be doing more? I think the answer is one, we can always be doing more. There's never a point where one has done enough. But if you're doing something at all, that means you're on the right track, and
okay.
you're having this conversation right here with me, and um, presenting it to your class, which is that is doing something. That means you're actively trying to spread awareness, which is really important. And I feel like even as a gay man, I wonder if there's more I can do within my own community, or one that's not within the LGBTQ community. And I have run into that same question sometimes where I'm like, do people like, I worry if other communities think that I'm not trying to help them, or that because I am white, I may be gay, but I am white. You know, do they think that I'm representing them at all? And how can I help them? Um, and do they know that? And then you have to get out of your head,
Yeah.
which, going back to the mental health stuff, it's most of these questions are in our head, and so we have to just kind of be chill about it, be like, no, I am doing something. And then more we just accept that we are, allows us to do more, basically, without really having to think about it too much, where it's like, okay, you just accept that, yeah, I'm helping, I'm here for it, and I'm doing what I can.
Yeah.
And I would like to do more, and just like leave it at that, don't think about it. And then you just find yourself falling into a rhythm where you can do those things, and because you're getting yourself out of this fight or flight mode of, am I helping, or
Yeah.
like, do people know I'm helping? And so now you can see opportunities for yourself to help, which is interesting. We talk a lot about mental health on our podcast too, so it's like there's a lot going on.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's kind of a look into like my psyche as well.
Yeah.
I'm a professor. I always feel like, am I doing this so people look at me and people know how important I am? And I've written about that and talked about that and talk about it to the students. Like, once you get past that, then it's actually very freeing, and it's a really great, beautiful experience to
It really is.
but it's also kind of a glimpse into like my psyche of like, am I, and even like, do I need other people's um not gratitude, but like like approval,
Acknowledgement,
acknowledgement and
yeah.
approval. And so it's um but I asked a question that was real. You gave a really interesting answer, because I asked, does the viewer or consumer decide
Oh,
what is coded or what is queer coded?
right.
And your response was that it's really the creator who decides it. Well, what I find interesting is, and I want to go to your discussion of Luca on disology, is and on the Mutant Ages, you two have talked about how you read things, and
Yeah.
you use the word read, which I think is awesome.
Yeah.
And like, so, from my perspective, when we watched Luca, I read it as, be more inclusive. Don't
Yeah.
exclude people that are different from you.
Yeah.
Regardless of who that is, regardless if that is somebody who is queer, somebody who is from a different nationality or a different ethnic or racial makeup than you. Like, don't try to be more inclusive as much as you can, and try to learn more about those people, because if you are trying to learn, then you're moving forward. And that's what we told our kids. Now, they're 5 and 7, so we didn't go into that long of an explanation. Basically, we told them, be nice to people.
Right.
But then, listening to the Disology podcast that you were on, you talked about how that was what you read for it was, like this kind of awakening,
Right.
and this experience. And so, does the person watching it, we're always going to read it from our own perspective. So is there like a one perspective that it should be read through, or is it like, this group reads it this way, another group
Yep.
reads it this way, this individual reads it this way, and everybody gets out of it what they want, or
I
what
have
they need, I should say?
I have like a multiple choice answer at this point. So going back to what you initially said, yeah, I do think the creator has the biggest influence there because they've written it themselves. However, yes, we also read into it, and we read oftentimes what is presented and what we want to see. So to say that it's just the creator and writer who's made this decision, and I think frequent times it is, we also read into things, and we see what we need out of it as well, and may read something new out of the telling that was not initially there. So it's a little bit of both. It's both the creator and the consumer, right? And basically, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this, but
well, real quick, if I could,
sure.
somebody on that episode,
Yeah.
can't remember who it was, said basically, like, they prescribed to death of the author. That, like,
that sounds like something Rachel would say, but
I think it was,
yeah,
I think it was her. That, that it regardless of what the creator intended, it's based on what people take from it.
right.
So go ahead. I
Well,
wanted to
sorry.
point that, because you
No,
reminded me of that.
you're right, and I think Luca itself is really interesting. it's a really interesting movie and film to utilize because that particular director spoke out about how he said this is not gay. It was based on
Mhm.
an experience I had growing up, and we are like, okay, you got to get some therapy then because like what's happening here? So like it was very strange to
I do
deny
have a
that.
comment on that also, but keep going because I don't want to
Yeah,
keep interrupting.
no, that's okay. Um, I think that sometimes we also influence what ends up happening to these stories as well. And sometimes people that are involved with the project can also influence where these characters are going. Um, I'm gonna use a couple examples. One is a Disney example where I never realized it until I was just doing some basic research right before we recorded this yesterday. That people looked at Beauty and the Beast and they were like, "Oh, Cogsworth and Lumiere, they're like
Mhm.
they're boyfriends," and I was like, what? I did not present that to me at all. But then immediately I saw that. I have no idea if that was originally intended or not. But they were both incredibly queer coded once when I started thinking about it. And I was like, oh, wait, no, they're both very feminine presenting characters and the very frail and like hypersexual. And I was like, okay, maybe I just wasn't thinking about it because it's a talking clock and candlestick. But, that is what's happening. But if we stray away from Disney for a second, I think about Stranger Things, which is just
Mhm.
really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds right now because the fourth season dropped. And in season 3, they introduced a gay character, Robin, who in the story, in the screenplay they had really, or sorry, I think the Duffer Brothers had originally written, was not a gay character. It was supposed to be the love interest to Steve.
Okay. Yeah.
And those actors did like a couple episodes and a couple read throughs. And uh, the actress for Robin walked over to them and was like, "Hey, we think this character is gay. Like, I don't think this is a straight character, but the way she's presented." And the Duffer Brothers rolled with it. So they actively changed um, what was going to happen to that character just from a creative side. And then you look at um, characters from other TV shows that are presented as straight. So, I could get into Legend of Korra right now, but I think I want to save that for a little bit later. But at the end, they do pair Korra with another woman. But for the entire show, she's presented as somebody that is, first of all, she's queer coded because she's very masculine acting, but she has a bunch of boyfriends. And the community itself was like, Korra is definitely gay, right? Like, look at the way she's acting. And I have no idea if that was the original intention or if the community itself affected what the
Yeah.
outcome of that became because the directors were receptive to what the community wanted, which also happens. So, like, there's a lot of factors that can affect how this is presented in a piece of media. And, that's why I was like, it's a multiple choice answer because you have the author itself originally could have included that on purpose, or the consumer saw that and they have read it that way and have made it so. And then sometimes the consumers actually influence what the creators are creating and makes it into that because the creator can see that story that the consumers
Mhm.
are seeing. And then other people involved with a story that are putting it together, like a movie or a TV show or even a comic book, contribute their ideas. Then, like, this is what I'm seeing for this character right now. And then they influence what the original director or writer is putting together. So it's just very interesting because it can just be read in so many different ways. And when we read into the things on the Mutant Ages with the X-Men, we're reading what we want to see and
Yeah.
what we're seeing. Um, and because of the Mutant Ages, we've been around for almost 4 or 5 years now. Like, I can't watch anything. I cannot consume anything without having to deep dive into what I think the coding is anymore. Like, I can't consume anything without doing that. And I think inherently I was doing that for a long part of my life growing up because I was looking for it just out of
Mhm.
like wanting characters or some sort of story to represent me because we really had nothing back in the early 2000s. Uh, and, just going back to that time period and like I've always been looking, and I think we all do this, and you probably do it
Mhm.
too, maybe not from like a queer perspective, but like characters that you relate to,
Mhm.
and why is that? uh and what your journey has been as a person. um so like it's very it goes far beyond queerness at that point.
Yeah.
But because of this Hayes Code, it has affected how media has presented uh and represented the queer community for decades,
Yeah.
and it's crazy.
Yeah. The when I listened to I listened to the Luca episode twice, and then I went
Yep.
back and watched Luca, and I'm just like, to be honest, I was just like in tears by the end, because I'm like, like the representation of like the two older women at the end,
Yeah, that
and
got
what y'all
me.
talked about, that, and it was that, uh, again, like kind of that psyche. I'm like, should I have seen this? Should I be paying more attention to this? What should I be doing? And so it was extremely interesting. And so I do want you to give a few examples of queer. Well, first, are there other examples of coding outside of queer coding from the Hays Code? Like, are there examples of those, or was that kind of the primary example?
No, there was like other things that wasn't allowed in the Hays Code, like nudity,
Yeah,
suggestive dances, like so like even just like a woman like being sexualized in a way that would either like be good or bad, like women using their sexuality in a negative way
mm,
to seduce men, but also women being in control of their sexuality and confident and being like, no, I am in charge, like I am the boss, like that also wasn't allowed because it was like they didn't want to give them the rights they had. So that's
yeah,
why I mean, think about the James Bond films, right?
yeah, yeah,
And they are an excellent source to go through the ages and just see how politics have changed, because like every film really showcases who does well in those and who doesn't, which cultures do well and which ones don't. But the James Bond films, like the earlier ones, uh, women don't get to do much. They're either like an object for James Bond to utilize in his mission, or they're there just to seduce him. Many of them just trip and fall down and die. They don't do very well. And then as they go on, suddenly we have like female villains.
yeah,
And then now in current day James Bond, we have female characters that are sometimes even better than James Bond is at his job, because that's just where we are politically at this point. Although we also again deal with the queer coding in that, where there's been a couple characters that have been presented as gay. Um, and Daniel Craig, of course, is fantastic. And he's the one that decided that James Bond is bisexual. And we're like, thank you, man. Like, this dude is always doing great things for our community. But that's a great example. Also, the Hays Code didn't allow ridicule of religion. So
okay,
that's why in those earlier films, you would see so many things going back to God, because like, you're doing the God is everything. It is God is the reason we are all here. And if there's anything that depicts God in a negative way or religion in a negative way, then it's bad, unless it's specifically like, here's the devil and this is why doing the bad thing will lead you to hell. This was all part of the code.
okay,
So I hope that answers the question a
yeah,
little bit more, but it's not just queer characters. It's like it's all the same fights that we've been having on the rights front for decades at this
yeah,
point. And
yeah,
so if it's like, women's rights, which right now we're regressing and we're going backward, and certain states are taking those away. But again, that's all based in like what society has pushed as knowledge over the years that has been false. And just continues to grow that way. And so there's a lot of like old generation versus new generation on what's okay and what's not okay. And right now we're just experiencing a huge historical moment across the board, because there's just so many rights issues that are being to the forefront, where it's like our generation and then the younger generations that are like, no, this is wrong, versus older generations that are trying to influence the younger generations. And this was done through the Hays Code too, because
yeah,
they're like, well, we have media and everyone's consuming movies and radio shows, so like these are the things that are allowed and that we're gonna allow. And there's still weird codes in movies now, although they aren't as restrictive as they used to be. But that's how we wound up with the weird rating system that we have. And there's a great documentary about it that I think I watched on Netflix 10 years ago that goes into the movie code and who decides what movies are presented as R and why they're rated R. And it's a lot of the same stuff where it presents stuff that's like, well, this seems like a hypersexual gay man. So like, we probably should make it rated R because like children under the age of 13 really shouldn't be seeing that. It's just, it's very strange what gets those ratings and what doesn't. So
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the comic code also.
yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's same situation, and that really affected comic books in a crazy way, especially within the X-Men.
yeah. And so what are some examples of queer coding in the Disney universe?
So, all right, this is where we get to start having some fun a little bit. So the most obvious ones are within the Disney villains pre 2020. So that is something that has only recently changed with Disney characters because they realized that queer coding the villains were still putting the queer community in a negative light. But given all the facts I gave you in terms of like being presented as vain or effeminate or frail or super masculine, you know, I'm gonna go like I made a huge list here, and I'll touch on all of them and only like talk about a couple of them in more detail. But we have Captain Hook, who I recently rewatched Peter Pan, and I actually really fell in love with Captain Hook again because I just didn't realize like I'd watched it as a kid and I thought there was something interesting going on with him then, but I didn't really understand what. But like as an adult, taking that in again, I was like, oh, this is a gay man, and like the pirate crew is they're just all gay. Like I got it now. But again, he's being presented as effeminate. And he's very into himself. He seems very frail. He's scared of things. He's not presented as manly. He's a great example. The one that everyone goes to is Ursula because she was literally based on a drag queen. Which I mean, we talked a lot about it on the Disology podcast, but just how she's presented as like masculine and loud and like just witchy and evil, and also there's like how she's putting on her lipstick in a way that like it was being drawn on by drag queens, and very unfortunate because the actress just passed away.
Yeah.
Like the voice of Ursula will not be able to be replicated by literally anybody else. Like she is just one of those voices that are iconic. She's another great example. Scar is the one I always go to because he is again presented as like weak and feminine and frail. And the thing with these villains is that a lot of the time I end up relating to them. And so I'm like, I don't know, man. They're kind of fighting for like, what is Ursula's deal? We never find out. We never find out really what Scar's deal is. Although very recently on the Lion Guard, they did a backstory on him that was still very gay, where he was like hanging out with another male lion that he had fired. And that's how he became Scar's when Mufasa rejected him. So I was like, very interesting stuff, but I think that was intentional now. But Scar is one of my favorites to go to. Governor Ratcliffe from Pocahontas is a very obvious one again. And he's got like a manservant that follows him around and it's like, what's going on? Gaston and LeFou. And I know Gaston's really interesting because he kind of loops himself around where Gaston presents as hyper masculine. And that's another thing that can happen with queer coding is that a queer character can be pushing themselves to be as much of his own gender stereotype as possible. So Gaston's like, I love women a lot and I love bodybuilding, but he's also very into himself. He's very vain. He is only interested in Belle, who is somebody that's presented as plain and uninteresting when there's like these beautiful women around him. And it's very much like, I want Belle to be my wife so she can be my beard, essentially. And we're going to have all these children to prove that I'm straight. And even though I've got LeFou here, who I'm clearly in a relationship with, like, it's just very interesting. And then when they did the remake of Beauty and the Beast, they actually went ahead and said that LeFou was queer, which only raises more questions about his relationship with Gaston. But that's another interesting one.
I wonder if because they had a Disney Plus series planned for that that
I
I think
don't
since has
know.
been canceled.
Well, I
Or
don't know.
not canceled, it's been suspended
Yeah, I don't know if it's
for an
because of,
extended time.
yeah, I don't know if it's been because of 2020 or
Yeah.
like because of the content that would have been involved. But also, I feel like these live action remakes they keep on releasing aren't very good, and I can't help but think that that may be contributing as to why they don't do expansions on it.
Yeah.
But just very quickly, I said Prince John for Robin Hood. He's another one, very vain, very effeminate. Hades is a great example because this is what's
Mm-hmm.
considered gay. Is he does the limp wrist thing. He's
Mm-hmm.
very funny. He's full of jokes. He's in charge of the underworld. He's always sashaying around and acting kind of like a drag queen. And so these are just like these queer coding traits that these characters take on. And as a queer community, we've latched onto them. And like we really love our Disney villains and we kind of want them to come back because we aren't getting represented in any other kind of
Mm-hmm.
way, which I'll talk about in a second. And there's been some more recent characters like Evelyn in The Incredibles 2 who really
Yeah.
seemed very, very interested in Elastic Girl on a more romantic level than anything else. And there's a part of that movie where Evelyn, before she's revealed to be the villain, is like, why don't you just leave The Incredibles and just come along with me kind of situation, which is again very queer coded because we're like, she's being very sexy when she says it, and it's just the vibe she gives. um and then I know that King Candy kind of returned to that in Wreck-It Ralph, the first movie, where suddenly we have this character who's just very feminine presenting. And it was kind of like a backward step for Disney because he also was not a fun villain. It's not like these previous characters, like Jafar's another one who falls into that category of very feminine characters. And you always have to wonder what happened that got these characters where they are. But then there's the flip side of it, which is, there's not a lot of it until recently. But I think the first one that I really wanted to dive into is that we now have Elsa from Frozen, who again also dabbled in villainy at the beginning of her
Mm-hmm.
movie. And she is a very queer coded character. Although she's not being presented in the way that the Hayes Code would have done it, where she would have been like masculine or presenting that way. It's just suddenly she's not interested in men. She's, taking care of herself, and she's very, at first, not confident. And they do a lot about anxiety with her. And it's just like her relationship with other women is very different from previous queens and princesses in the Disney history. And
So
we're all, I'm sorry.
if people read into Elsa as like very focused on what she wants, like, because I know there are some people who have like read into it that way as well.
Yeah.
So again, is that an example of kind of coming at it from a person's lens?
Well,
Or
I think I think it's coming from a person's lens on that. And her being confident, I don't necessarily think is a queer trait. I mean, you can be confident and not queer, right? So, but what goes on with Elsa and her story is there's a lot of her coming out, like about who she is, like suppressing her powers, suppressing who she is,
Mhm.
coming out and being free of that, being told that what she has is wrong and that she can't have these things. So eventually she releases herself, and it's just a freeing feeling for her. And then in Frozen 2, she's still being like, okay, well, I have everything I want, but I still feel like something's missing. And
Yeah.
which is still not even fully released in that movie. Like she still doesn't fully figure it out. And so that's why we're all hoping they're like, come on, Disney, Frozen 3, just give us the bone. Like let her be gay. Cause like she's dealing with all these inner feelings. And sort of the queer coding for her specifically is how hurtful and painful it can be for somebody that buries their feelings, buries everything about themselves because that's what they're told to do to be good, right? Or what's correct, and how damaging it is to that person. um and Elsa is, and she's huge in the drag scene. Drag queens love Elsa. Like
Okay.
she is just, she's very interesting. And I think she's the first really true representation that's not just a true Disney villain, that we're like, we're seeing queer coding in this character that is not presented in a negative way, because she's also admired by so many people.
Mhm.
Um, across the board. Um, and so I find her very interesting because of that. And also very
I don't want to be
recently,
rude, but
no,
we talked
you
before.
yeah, I know you've got a cough going on. No worries. But I'm running out of water. But the other thing that happened recently is that in Encanto, um, this has not been talked about enough yet, in my opinion. But Bruno was absolutely queer coded, and
Hmm,
to the
okay.
point where people who worked on the film have said that they were like, no, Maribel and Bruno have a something different about them from everybody else. And when you think about it, like those are the only characters aside from the children who do not have love interests.
Hmm.
And Bruno himself, we do the whole we don't talk about Bruno because I don't know, because he was creating superstitious premonitions that were kind of bad, maybe. But like in queer coding, it's like, no, we don't talk about Bruno because he's gay. And we're gonna literally send him away because he's gay. Um, and it's I remember watching, if you watch the behind the scenes, it's on Disney Plus. They do the behind the scenes of Encanto, and they were going over the dance routine for We Don't Talk About Bruno,
Hmm.
and the choreographer was like, yeah, I'm a gay man and I relate to Bruno because like of people not talking about me, and I didn't want my family not to talk about me either. And it was like I'm watching it with my friend, and suddenly I'm like bawling, and I'm like, I didn't know that this is supposed to be Bruno. And so having that has been huge for me because I didn't even recognize it fully
Yeah.
when I saw it. But to know that the people who worked on it were intentionally doing that changes things. And like also recently with Raya and the Last Dragon,
Hmm.
Raya and Amari, like I thought they were gonna date straight out of the gate when that movie started. Then suddenly they became enemies, but their love for each other and the planet is what brought everybody together. And I was like, okay, but see, that's also where queer coding is going away now. Where like, yes, we're being queer coded because we're reading into it and we're seeing these characters supposedly have a connection that is more than just friendship, but it's not being presented to us in the way that the Hayes Code would. Whereas you look at somebody like Pleakley, the alien from Lilo and Stitch, who's just presented as a masculine character that's always doing drag,
Hmm.
which is like very negative. Although I love Pleakley, I love Lilo and Stitch. So it's so the queer coding can go both ways. It's just more prominent with the villains of Disney. And they have released canonical characters that are gay in Disney, but it's not been enough. Like saying that Oaken is gay in Frozen is quite frankly an insult to me because he's the goofy one. And I know
Yeah.
people love Oaken because he's funny, but I'm like, no, we're still doing that thing where we've stereotyped the one gay character and we've decided that he's a joke
Hmm.
and that like he's silly and he's like, oh, look at me. And it's like, that's not really great either. And then they do it again with LeFou, and they're like, "Well, look, we made LeFou gay." And I'm like, "Same thing. He's a joke character." McGregor on Jungle Cruise. Although I really loved Jungle Cruise, and I loved McGregor, and I
Yeah, it was a
really,
really, really good movie.
yeah, I was not expecting that to be like Indiana Jones Tomb
Yeah.
Raider level excitement. But when I was watching it, the thing I did like about that film and with McGregor's character, because again, he's being presented in these queer coded ways where he's got all the luggage and he can't fight like his sister can, and he's just not manly in any kind of way. That was very annoying to watch. But what I did like is that there's a scene where he comes out to uh the Rock's
Yeah.
character, and his
Yeah.
character goes, "Oh, that's cool with me." And I was like, that is beautiful. That was very touching for me to see, despite them doing all this weird other stuff until we got to that point. Um, but like, even like I know that Onward had a gay character named Officer Spectre to the point where I didn't even remember she was in it. Like,
Oh
and
yeah,
I
I didn't.
yeah. Um, and the other one I pointed out on my list is that because Pixar is really trying to push for
Hmm.
more characters. I mean, obviously, Lightyear just came out, and Alicia Hawthorne, who is Buzz Lightyear's best friend, is a woman who's gets married to another woman. And that's presented as normal in that society, which is great. They don't even say much about it. They show that they get married and they kiss, and they just don't make a big deal about it. And it's very natural, and I liked it. Got banned from China, of course, and
So
also
is that the best like kind of representation or inclusion?
um,
I mean,
well,
it was part of like that time period where he's time traveling, and it was just very um, it was just very normalized, and
I think
nobody
okay,
said anything.
yeah. So here's the thing, because I've had this conversation with people, because for me, like, I would like to see more, but I've had conversations with people where they're like, I just want to get to the point where we're not talking about this anymore, not because we don't want it to be. And these are queer friends of mine where they're like, they're saying that they don't want to have to discuss it anymore, basically. And they're
Okay.
like, we want to be at a point where it's just normal, but we're not there yet. So I feel like it needs to be a little grander. But what Lightyear does is where we ultimately want to wind up, where it's just like we have Buzz as a character who I guess is straight. We'll never really know. And then his best friend who is not. And it's just presented as normal in that universe. And we're able to see that character's arc in her lifetime pass by, um, and without it being a big deal and just
Mm-hmm.
being part of normal culture. That's where we want to be. But I think in order to actually get there, we need to have greater, more dramatic characters. Like
Yeah.
Elsa, if she turned out to be gay, I think that would be a much bigger hit than this character who does die within the first half an hour of the
Yeah.
movie. Although I'm not necessarily against it, because I feel like they handled it really well, where Buzz just, when she says that she's engaged, she goes, "Oh, I'm so happy for you." Like, it's normal to them. And that's where we want to eventually get to. But I feel like we've jumped to where we want to be versus doing the work to get there.
Yeah.
And the other thing that Pixar did is they did one of their shorts that was just about a gay couple and having them come out to their parents, and worried that the father wouldn't accept him. And he does at the end. And that was a very touching and bold move on Pixar's part, because Pixar's been very proactive about this. And honestly, with the whole Don't Say Gay bill in Florida and how Disney did not respond to it right away, really changed how things were being handled across the board, because then suddenly Lucasfilms, Pixar, and Marvel were all like, no, we've got to stand up for this. Disney, you represent us. So if you don't say anything, we're going to get real vocal about it. And it has started to change things. We're starting to see queer characters be represented in media, not in the way that we need them to be yet, but it's happening.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean. It's like we have all these queer coded characters, and the ones that openly are queer are either like a non-playable character like in the background, or they're a joke, and that's not helpful for us. And
two comments on that. I think going back to your original comment when you first started talking about Luca and the director, I had the privilege of listening to that episode following Pixar coming out and saying, like, putting a gay character in Lightyear, and supposed to remove the kiss and then putting it back in, and so I had the privilege of listening to it then, and so I immediately thought, like, well, I mean, was that just a corporate thing? Like, he couldn't say that because of the corporate culture, because people had been coming out and saying that that's the parent company wasn't necessarily comfortable with that type of out and out representation, or like out in front representation. And then well, I lost the other thing now. This is why I take notes, but I'm sure I'll think about it here in just a little bit. But go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that with Luca and Pixar, like, I think because of what's happening politically right now, it's allowed us to open that door again. And Luca's just it is so controversial in the sense that supposedly it's not a gay story, as the director has stated, but so many people are not reading it that way. And just Luca in general, like, I feel like it was very queer coded, like across the board, from just how they were seen as monsters, and his relationship with this other guy, and the other kid being abandoned by his parents for wanting to be different. And then, of course, the two women that are also hiding because they don't want to be seen. There's a whole piece in there where Luca's parents are going to send him away to like what essentially is going to be like a conversion therapy camp. It is just like, it hits all the points in such a way that it was just so shocking to hear the director say, no, it's not that way. But then to follow it up with a comment of it's based on my own life and be like, there's a lot going on here with this one comment.
Yeah. So the let's talk about the mutant ages.
Sure.
And I will warn everyone when Ryan first told me about the mutant ages, he said it's very explicit. It is. It's hilarious, but it is very explicit for anybody.
I mean, it's professional, but not education level professional.
And so, but I've listened to a few episodes, and two of them that I listened to, because I told you I didn't really watch a lot of the animated.
Yeah, of course.
I've seen all of the live action Fox X-Men movies.
Yeah.
So I listened to the 2 episodes on Days of Future Past.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I thought of is how does the X-Men franchise represent the LGBTQ community?
So the X-Men, very interesting. Like they're so good. Where do you even start with the X-Men? So the X-Men do something that really nothing else does still. And initially when Stanley wrote it, he was pulling a lot of his politics from Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which is behind Professor Xavier and Magneto to a degree, although I think at this point it has shifted so much more. But Stanley, back when he was alive, has spoken about how he was mortified that people of color didn't have equal rights, and later expressed that the queer community couldn't have that either. And it reflects in his work with the X-Men more than anything else he put out. And then Chris Claremont, who is sort of the one that really transformed the X-Men into the X-Men that we know past the Golden and Silver Age, which, like it's the same as DC Comics, where the Golden and Silver Age, it's got some good stuff in there, but it is goofy as hell. And Chris Claremont, Louise Simonson, Jim Lee really kind of took it to the next level, where they went into what was actually politics of its time.
Okay.
In the 80s and 70s, what was happening, and even the 90s, what was happening within the LGBTQ communities and queer communities were like, it was crazy. And like, yes, they pull from other points of history as well, especially with Black Lives Matter. But it's a show, or sorry, it's a comic book and show, a movie series that is about marginalization across the board. But their biggest pull from, and they have stated it repeatedly, by the creators and the writers behind it, that it is influenced very heavily by LGBTQ politics and what we as our community have gone through in terms of our fight and our suffering and our successes. And the X-Men has, to this day, probably the most not only queer coded characters, because many of them were written to be queer coded, many of them, and the X-Men have more characters than the Avengers do, which is a whole thing we can talk about with the MCU and how they'll be introduced, because I think when X-Men are in the MCU, it's going to be primarily about the X-Men, because how can it not be? But since then, as politics have changed in the real world, they have written many of their characters to start coming out. And right now we're going through what we call the Krakoa era, where all the mutants are now living on like a mutant island, basically, with their own nation. And every month these writers are just outing these characters that have been hinted at as gay, because they couldn't for a very long time, even because they had the comic code authority, which was the same thing as the X-Men codes go. The X-Men code, the X-Men theme. Sorry, it's my ringtone going off right now. It was the same thing where they couldn't showcase these things. But in terms of the actual politics that you will see within the X-Men, I think a lot about the legacy virus, which was straight up an AIDS metaphor. The Cure, which was about conversion camps and conversion therapy. Senator Kelly's Mutant Registration Act, which is a terrifying premise where and this is how Magneto ended up being rewritten into a Jewish character, where it's like, okay, when you suddenly register somebody as a specific marginalized class and how dangerous that is, how messed up that is. And the MCU they're already getting their way. They're building the the foundation for this,
Mhm.
especially after Endgame. Um, but and this is something that we're terrified about right now with what's happening in the world with the Don't Say Gay bill. And like
Mhm.
once when you start pushing for that, what other acts of politics and bills can be passed against you and put a target on your back,
Yeah.
essentially, which is what Senator Kelly does. You have the purifiers, which is when religious, not cults, but like religion and religious groups get together and they've decided what is right and what's wrong and what's abominations, and they are out to hunt mutants. You have Moira McTaggart, who is now a villain in the comic books, and for a very long time was not presented that way, but she has been around since the 80s, and I've always seen her as a villain. But she's been like supposedly helping mutants with the cure. She had a mutant son that she kept in her basement and didn't want to leave and let out because he was too dangerous, and like locked him up and experimented on him to help him, which is extremely messed up. You have the Hellfire Club, which is like a whole mutant underground society. And you have the Morlocks, who are pushed under the streets of New York because they can't even pass as human, which through our lens on the Mutant Ages, we've had lots of trans listeners write in about
Mhm.
how they relate to the Morlocks because they don't know if they can pass as the gender that they're trying to be or are
Okay.
supposed to be. You have the Sentinel program is when you decide to create a weapon that is going to eliminate and capture people of a marginalized class. Then you have Apocalypse, who's a mutant who wants to have the opposite happen. He wants to assimilate everybody into being mutants, which there are people who are there that are like, no, everyone should be queer, which that's not helpful either. There's a comparison of mutants being dangerous, like weapons, and just sort of how anti-police the X-Men are because of how they are targeted by the government, by the police, how there are riots all the time. In the X-Men stories, there are always riots happening outside of Xavier's mansion. There's like people out there saying that they mutants need to be like dealt with, that they aren't allowed to exist. And a lot of what they pull from the X-Men and the history of their writing actually comes a lot from Stonewall and just the struggle of um you know like cops and other anti-gay communities coming into our community and attacking us and trying to shut us
Mhm.
down, which is what happens with the X-Men. And sort of the X-Men as a vigilante group that is pushing back against this when there are plenty of mutants in the Marvel universe, but the X-Men are the ones that are standing up and fighting the fight and trying to get equal rights, but people don't see them as equal because they have superpowers that then make them dangerous in some way or another. And on our show, we have to take the critical lens, and so we are reviewing things. And yes, we get very goofy and we get off the rails and we laugh and can sometimes get very raunchy, but like that's part of it. And
Yeah.
I find that a lot of time as we pull apart what the politics are of the episode, what we're reading is oftentimes queer politics that we've experienced in our own life. And even though I've always been pro mental health, I had not really been in therapy quite exclusively as I have been since we started doing the show, because both my co-host Maddie and I were pulling out these experiences that we had just watching episodes and realizing how much trauma we had experienced growing up as queer kids, as queer kids that were open with our queerness when we were teenagers, and when people weren't doing that, like,
Yeah.
and we had to be very careful about who we told that information to, whereas now we're very open about it. And just kind of seeing the relations that we have with the X-Men, and how much they pull from it. And the cartoon X-Men Evolution, which we finished up a few months ago before we moved on to Wolverine and the X-Men, specifically said that they were pulling from LGBTQ
Okay.
politics. And it was released during the time that we were finishing up high school. And it's about the X-Men if they were in high school and trying to like hide that. And to the level that we were like, every single episode was emotional for us because we're like, we went through the same sufferings
Yeah.
that the X-Men are going through on this show. um, and that we hooked onto it because it was really the only representation that we had or closest to it for many, many years until we started seeing things like Legend of Korra or Steven Universe, which we talk a lot about on the show because Steven Universe has been very like it has changed how queerness is expressed in animation period because it just outwardly made everybody queer on that show. And we were like, if we had this show growing up, we would be able to know so much more about our
Mhm.
emotions. But no, we had the X-Men. We still have the X-Men. And they are very representative of the LGBTQ community in so many ways that I just listed. But you also have to remember it's for marginalized classes in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
Although we could at least include characters of color in the X-Men, which they did. The X-Men has a very diverse cast of people from all over the world, which was something that Chris Claremont really pushed for, and it's continued to trend with every writer on the X-Men. And so it's been cool to have that representation in there. I remember in like post 9/11, they went ahead and added like a Muslim character as part of the
Mhm.
X-Men, which was a very bold move
Yeah.
at that time. But the point being is that it's always been about marginalization and what it does to a community for being different. Um, and the X-Men have been with me like my whole life in a way that the Disney villains have. So, you know, when I got started getting tattoos done, of course I got X-Men tattoos, and they were like, "Are you sure about this?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's the only thing that's been here with me since like I was a
Yeah.
kid."
Yeah.
So, you know, but to answer your question, yes, there's so many more plot lines I could dive into. I just feel like those are some great examples of where the X-Men have represented the LGBTQ community. Besides the fact that many of their characters are queer coded, and many of them have come out, which I can get into when you're ready to talk about that. I just wanted to make sure that we got through this point first.
Yeah. Well, and like my experience with the show has been that very eye-opening,
Yeah,
and very educational, very informational. It's much like, it like you said, it is explicit, it's funny, um, but it really gets to the heart of things.
yeah,
And it is it's one of those that I listened to the 2 episodes, and I went back the last 2 days and I watched Days of Future Past.
yeah.
And while I was watching, I said, okay, there were a few things that, okay, maybe I don't understand. And I'm looking at my TV, sorry. It's like a point of reference.
It jars your memory, you know.
But I'm like, okay, there may be some things that I don't understand to be that, or I don't connect with, but I understand this and this and this and this and this.
Yeah,
And I see all of these things. And so one thing that I really appreciate about it is that kind of just expanding your universe, expanding
right,
your knowledge and your like exposure to different things. So
right.
what are you went through some examples and you went through some of the plot lines and everything, but what are some of the characters um that are either queer coded or openly queer in the X-Men?
Yeah. So it's hard for me to not. It's hard for me to, especially listen to our show. I'm just like all of them, but they're queer coded in a very different way, where they're not queer coded in a negative way. Like Chris
Okay.
Claremont, Louise Simonson, Jim Lee, Stan Lee, Grant Morrison, Kieran Gillen. They're not writing these characters to be queer coded as to how the Comic Codes Authority wanted that to be written,
Okay.
or the Hayes Code. Um, they wrote it in a much more realistic way, where it's like these characters are clearly gay, but they can't say that. And they can't present that anywhere because it's too dangerous. They're already mutants, so like we can't present them as gay because it's already dangerous enough that they're mutants. So we're just going to represent them through the mutants, just as that concept. Um, and I wrote down a huge list, and it's like so many of these characters have since come out as queer, but I'm gonna go through them. So first of all, there's Mystique and Destiny, who if you've seen the X-Men movies, you know who Mystique is. The X-Men movies don't do a good job of portraying what her character is really like, which is why I'm hoping when she comes to the MCU, we get a much better portrayal. Um, because Mystique in the comic books is a character who is gender fluid, number one. Originally was written to be able to reproduce both as a male as male and female, but they decided not to go for that in the long run. And she was always paired up with this other woman, Destiny, who is a prophet. And Mystique and Destiny were for a very long time villains of, or not really villains. They were another perspective that the X-Men were fighting with, just like real politics. Um, and the way that they were coded was like they had their daughter Rogue. We all know Rogue, and they raised her together. They did everything together. Like it was very clear that they were being written this way. And as time passed, Chris Claremont himself said he's like, no, Mystique and Destiny are supposed to be together, but I can't write that into a story right now. So you just have to look for the clues. And since then, as politics have changed, especially within comic books, Destiny was dead for a long time, and they recently brought her back to life. And so, in current comic books, there is so much emphasis on the relationship with each other, in like them being married. Like they're not even not in a relationship; they straight up are kissing. They're married. It's all about them, and like it's just they are such the front page of queerness in the X-Men right now that it's really fantastic because they are two characters that were originally written that way, could not be said to be gay, and now with our current day and age they can, and we're just getting so much of that. And so many of our writers on the X-Men right now are queer themselves, have been very open about this and presenting that through their characters and trying to out them slowly, um, which is really great. I look at Rogue, who we call her, and Gambit are disaster bisexuals, which they are not out as bisexual, but it's very clear that like they're very interested in both. But Rogue's a very interesting gay metaphor because she can't touch anyone, and that she's seen dangerous for touching people. And there's something very heavy about the 80s AIDS epidemic and how if you had contact with somebody who was gay, you could contract AIDS, which is what they were pushing politically in the media at the time. And that is also when Rogue was created, was during that time period. And so she's definitely a metaphor in that sense. Gambit is just wildly sexy. He's very flirtatious, no matter if it's a man or woman. They have not explicitly shown him with anyone other than women, but writers have tried to push for him to be outed as bisexual, although at the time that they were doing that, whoever the CEO of Marvel at that time rejected it. Yeah. Although I feel like we're getting to a very close point where they're going to acknowledge that with Gambit and Rogue pretty soon. There's Iceman, who to the T has just been like this goofy gay character for many years, and these very awkward relationships with women, just a few of them. But he's always been presented as like, oh, check out that hot girl over there, and it's like, why are you doing that, dude? Like, no, like I don't know a lot of straight men that are just like standing around like gawking and yelling, like, look, she's so hot. Like, I mean, there are, but like, you know, just over the top, trying to present himself as masculine, even though he himself is like slender and slim and looks like a little twink. And I've always read him as gay my whole life, and I've been rereading old X-Men comics recently because I'm just going back to the beginning with many things right now, just because I feel like I am trying to digest history of media that I've grown up with. And even in that, he's like screaming things. He's like, oh, where's my little black booties? And I'm like, this man is gay. And he's actually out now. They've outed him, and they've been trying to out him for a long time. But now he's kind of like the gay icon of the X-Men. And him and Northstar, who was actually written as gay in the 80s and was not treated very well as a result of that. Although Northstar has a really great story about his coming out story when a little baby has AIDS and he like has a mental breakdown about it. But they also made him very like hypersexual. Ben's always at his house, just seeing him in a negative light. For a long time, we thought Northstar and Iceman was going to be a thing, but it was not. And Northstar did get the very first gay wedding in the comic book period, which was in the 2010s. and he's a great character too, and he's very famous and popular. And it's very interesting to see these characters come out over time. And then there's Kitty Pryde, who was written to be she was written to be queer by Chris Claremont. And since then, she's had a lot of boyfriends. So now at this point in the evolution of her character, it's like she can't just be like a gay character, but she was written that way. She was written that way to have relationships with the characters Magic and Rachel Gray.
Okay.
Rachel Gray just recently, as in a couple of weeks ago, finally was announced as a gay character because she confessed her feelings for another woman, Psylocke, who's also now out. And these all are all characters we grew up with being like, we think these characters are gay. And like now they're just coming out like in streams. Kitty Pryde's another one. She's now out as bisexual. There was two characters in the 90s, Shatterstar and Richter, who I think was written by Rob Liefeld, and we don't need to talk about him, but he didn't write those characters to be gay, even though they were very clearly gay, and they are now gay in the comic books, and that is just how it is. And they have been represented that way for almost 20 years now, which is crazy to think about. There's Storm. We all know who Storm is.
Mm-hmm.
Storm had literally, they wrote a girlfriend for her named Yukio into the comic books, but because of the comic codes authority, they couldn't do that. So they never actually had a relationship in the comic books, but she was originally Yukio was designed to be Storm's girlfriend.
Okay.
And Storm goes through this whole thing in the 80s where she basically has a breakdown and discovery of herself where she suddenly goes all goth. She gets the famous mohawk look that people reference all the time for Storm. And that's what we call her lesbian phase. There's Beast, who has also been presented. Beast is a very confusing and complicated character, and I love him. He's been mostly with women, but for a while he claimed he was gay because he's like, well, people are going to hate me otherwise. But, Cyclops is like, I don't think you're gay. And so we think that he pushed Beast back in the closet. That's our ongoing theory. But he's another character who's queer coded in the sense he's like very smart. He's reciting poetry and doing theater all the time. But what's represented him in terms of the metaphor is that he hates himself. And originally he was not a blue beast. He invented a chemical to try and repress his look and ended up making it so much far worse. And I think that actually got represented very well in some of the later incarnations of Beast in the movies. With him constantly be like, I hate myself, and his weird relationship with Mystique that is not in the comic books, thank God, because it's very weird in the movies. But what they did well with that is that Mystique was like, I don't mind being blue. And he's like, I wish I didn't look this way. Yeah. And even in the comics and the TV shows, Beast is always doing questionable things where he's trying to suppress his feelings. And every single time he tries to suppress that mutant gene in him, he gets more beastly. Yeah. And it's a great metaphor for the longer you suppress your queerness or your feelings for other people of the same gender, how much self-harm that inflicts on yourself. And also you think you yourself are a monster. So Beast is just a very interesting character in that way. And just a couple more, I promise you. We have Deadpool, who is canonically pansexual. Okay. And he flirts with both. He's in love with Spider-Man. Like, that's like a canonical fact. And Ryan Reynolds is pushing to get Deadpool to represent this, along with Cable, in his movies. Thank you, Ryan. There's Mr. Sinister, who is one of our very favorite characters. He's always been presented as this very feminine, gender fluid character. He's basically the Dr. Frankenfurter of the X-Men, which, Rocky Horror, who Dr. Frankenfurter is. Mr. Sinister is exactly that energy. He doesn't really fall into either gender category. He's always obsessed with making the perfect, like, X-Men for himself or mutant for himself. Yeah. He's obsessed with Scott and Alex Summers. It's just, he's very obviously a queer character. He's always surrounded by other characters that work for him. They're all very gender fluid. Like, we had Gorgeous George. Lots of them seemed like they're drag queens, or just trans altogether. It's just, he's just a really interesting character, and we love him. And then finally, well, actually not finally, there's a couple more points there. You have Wolverine, who is a hyper masculine character, and so many people want him to be bisexual because he just does not seem like a character that would even care about if you're a man or a woman. He's always been paired with women as his character, and I think a lot of straight people would be like, well, I can't say a lot of straight people, because a lot of straight people are here for it, but also a lot of them are very much like uncomfortable with the idea of Wolverine possibly being bisexual. But it's to the point where there's another alternate universe version of him where he is gay, and
Okay.
like that was like a big deal. And the fact that that even exists at all is usually pretty telling uh, of a character, what he's supposed to be written as his actual self. And so
Okay.
Wolverine falls in the same category with Storm, where they're both obviously bisexual, but they haven't been presented that way outwardly yet, and we can't see that. We just have to see that based on their relationships with other people, because they both have very close relationships with like other characters of the same gender. Like Storm is very close with Yukio, Logan's very close with Nightcrawler. And where's the line between them being close friends and bros versus them also having feelings that are beyond that together?
Yeah.
That's a great example. And then, of course, Charles Xavier and Magneto, who are very much act like they're always ex-boyfriends that are getting back together constantly, because they're just so petty about what's going on between them. And it's like, is this even about politics, or is this about like some sort of other relationship that you're not telling us about? And to the point where many people think that Magneto and Xavier have had that relationship. And in First Class, Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy tried to really play that up as much as they could in those films. So, and then of course we got Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, who, like, I'm pretty sure it was Patrick Stewart who officiated Ian McKellen's wedding. So it's just interesting to see these characters, and there's many more who are queer coded. There are many more that are just openly queer, and they're left and right dropping them out of in the Krakoa era right now as queer and letting them come out, because we have, in modern day, we can do that. And then even if you look at something that is even queer, like if you look at the weird, not weird, but the polyamorous relationship that is now openly that between Cyclops, Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Emma Frost.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you were not seeing poly people being represented in the media, and we are now seeing that. And I think the X-Men has always stood up for the LGBTQ community in this way, but marginalization as well. But the fact that I can come here and give you this detailed of a listing of characters, and this is not happening anywhere else. It's not happening in any other series. And whenever I try and find something that's relatable or close to the X-Men in terms of these characterizations or this symbolism with queer coding or queer characters, it's not there in anything else to the level that the X-Men continues to do. And so in the LGBTQ community, like, they're huge. We love them. Like, if you go to a gay bar, everybody knows who the X-Men are. Like, that's just how it is.
Okay.
So I'm gonna pass the microphone back to you, because I just talked a lot, and I'm sure you have questions for me. So.
Well, I wanted to talk about staying on the X-Men, but looking toward the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah,
I wanted to get your thoughts on them being introduced into the MCU, and you like you said, once they're introduced, they're probably going to take over much of the MCU,
right?
Which I mean, now they just revealed when Phase 4 ends, and Phase 5 and Phase 6, and now we're in the multiverse saga. Is 7, 8, 9? Is that going to be a saga specifically dealing with something related to the X-Men, or although those characters would obviously show up different places. What I think is so interesting, and I want to let everybody know that Ryan mentioned this as well, so I want to give credit to him as well. But the story of Miss Marvel, Miss Marvel, obviously at the end of, they didn't say mutant, they didn't say
I think they said mutation.
Yeah,
I think they said that.
It's
and
something
it plays the X-Men thing. Yeah. Okay.
And what was so interesting about that is, and this is the part that I want everybody to know, Ryan has in his notes also, that the reason she was written as an Inhuman was for a very corporate reason.
Yeah.
At that time, I think it was Ike Perlmutter didn't want to write her as an X-Man or as member of the X-Men and have Fox have the rights to her movies and her projects.
Yep.
So they like created this whole Inhuman storyline, or not even a story, like Inhuman universe almost, so they could introduce characters like her. And now, it's kind of, at least it seems that the MCU is going to kind of dodge around that, and they're going straight to the mutant. So what are your thoughts on, because she is the first one that has on screen been acknowledged as, again, not necessarily a mutant, but having a mutation.
Um, yeah, this is fascinating. So the Inhumans, first of all, they've been writing about them since like the 60s, but we weren't really paying attention to them in the same way that we kind of had not paid attention to the Guardians of the Galaxy for 30, 40 years. But they brought them back because of what you said, of the struggle that was Fox versus Disney for like 10 years of the MCU. And it's also the same reason why the Fox, it affected everything. The Fox films were not great. I mean, the representation of what they're supposed to actually represent in those films really strays away after the first X-Men film, and just gets further and further away from that point as they go on. And it's very clear that they looked at characters in a comic book and said, we like that one, put them in it. We don't know anything about them or what they do, but just put them in the story. And with Miss Marvel, it's what you said. They didn't want her to have those rights given to Fox because of what Fox was doing. And at that time in the comic books, they were not funneling like very much money into the X-Men stories. So there was like a good like 8 years where comics about the X-Men were just really boring and uninteresting, and not against those writers. They were just limited on what stories they were even allowed to tell, because they were trying desperately, Disney was, to pull away any kind of funding or money or profit that Fox was making from this, because they really wanted the X-Men and Fantastic Four as part of their inclusion or their property. And so Miss Marvel was supposed to be one of those characters, and then she was written as an Inhuman instead. And I tweeted about it at the time because there were so many people that were so excited about this, that Miss Marvel was the first mutant, which I thought was so smart that they also took like a Pakistani character and made her be like the first mutant, because I'm like, good, you understand that this is about marginalization, and that's a huge chunk about what that show Miss Marvel was about. And so smart that they went that way. But there was a little pushback from people that really liked Miss Marvel as Inhuman, and I tweeted out at the time, and I was like, she was not supposed to be an Inhuman. That was something that's just included to get around all the nonsense that was happening. There's a reason why we've strayed away from the Inhumans in the MCU as a concept. And it's interesting how they're retconning things, because in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they wrote Quake, who also was a mutant, as an Inhuman in that show. And there's a very strong rumor right now that she'll be returning for Secret Wars, Secret Invasion, because she was a big part of that comic book story. And they're saying that she is being retconned back into a mutant on that as well. Like that they're doing a lot toward making that happen. So now here's something that I want to bring up, because you were talking about like they just dropped all those titles and they showed us up to 2025, but they didn't show us anything that was happening in 2025. They just gave us those 2 Avengers titles, and they're like, we can't tell you what else is coming. I was like, I bet you those are X-Men titles that they cannot show us. And we have a couple theories on the mutant ages between us and the listeners, where we think that maybe they'll start sprinkling mutants characters into the MCU to lead up to this. But some interesting information that was just leaked or released, I don't really remember how it came into existence or like how the public got it, but we found out the reason we're not seeing it's taking so long for us to even get to the X-Men, despite that this purchase happened back in like 2020 or whatever. That because of contracts, those contracts don't fully expire with Fox until 2025. So we're really not going to see anything until like, because they just legally can't. And I think that's why Kevin Feige, I can never pronounce his last name. I think it's Feige. Feige, got it. He showed us that big blank slot. Because he can't actually show us those titles. And I do think that because of what's happened with Black Panther and the passing of Chadwick Boseman, that they will turn to Storm because that is Marvel's other most prominent Black character. There's plenty of Black characters in the Marvel universe, but like everyone knows Black Panther and Storm.
Yeah.
They have been pivotal for the Black community, and I'm absolutely sure that if Storm does not get her own movie, that she's going to get some sort of Disney Plus show. And they have hinted in the MCU, which I saw you put some notes in here because you mentioned Ursa Major and Black Widow.
Yeah.
But like, we don't really know if he's a mutant. We don't really even know if that was fully Ursa Major, other than the credit that they gave him in the credits itself. But there have been a couple other characters in the MCU, like obviously Patrick Stewart appeared in the other universe as Professor Xavier, and that opened up so many questions. But Molly Hernandez in Runaways was a mutant, and they changed that for the TV show because, again, of the rights. So it's like we've had mutant characters that have been rewritten for the MCU, and are they going to change that? And most prominently right now is Scarlet Witch, who is so complicated because she was a mutant for so many years. She was in all the cartoons as a mutant. She is the daughter of Magneto, the most famous of the X-Men villains, if you can even call them that, with her brother Quicksilver. And in the MCU, they did some other, she was genetically enhanced. And then WandaVision came out. They're like, it was like really inside her all along because she had her witch powers. And the reason why that happened is that was, again, because of Fox versus Disney. And they couldn't explicitly say that she was a mutant. So they got around that. And in the comic books, they changed very randomly her origin story along with Quicksilver. And it's now in the MCU, we're like, all right, are we going to bring it back? Is she going to be a mutant? Apparently, one of the scenes they recorded for WandaVision but decided not to utilize was that the alternate version of Wanda Maximoff's father was going to appear, and it was going to be Michael Fassbender. So it seems to me they are going in that direction. But it brings up that question: is she going to be a mutant? And Elizabeth Olsen right now, with her success as Scarlet Witch, has also been very vocal about wanting to be alongside the X-Men. So I think that will happen because at this point her popularity is the power. But in terms of mutants joining the MCU, there have been a lot of theories. People are like, okay, so are they going to be like genetically altered people in terms of like scientific experimentation? Will Wanda suddenly make mutants appear in the MCU? And I'm like, it cannot be any of those things, because if you do either of those things, it immediately rejects the whole purpose of mutants, in which it's just been evolution and it's just part of who you are. And Kevin Feige has said that he doesn't want that. He wants to make sure that it's actually about marginalization and tells that story. So I actually go back to X-Men Evolution, the cartoon, which they presented that show that mutants existed, but nobody knew about them because they were scared to show that, especially because of their powers, and that the easy answer is that they've been there all along. And so we just need to start focusing on the discovery of mutants, which if I keep on fantasizing about one of those post-credit scenes where Nick Fury walks out with Maria Hill and she's like, have you seen these mutants? What's the deal with them? Which would be very, very, very cool. But if they're just there all along. And I think
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. I think you probably had a good thought there.
Well, no, I think when you mentioned Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, they're such an interesting story that these are the things that I really, really enjoy. I enjoy the stories. I'm not a huge fan of the comics, although I have Marvel Unlimited. I'm not sure if that's I think that makes me like not a real comic fan because I don't have
it is now. But no, are you kidding me? I've honestly donated and sold off most of my comic books in lieu of digital versions or graphic novels. So
but the things that are so interesting to me outside of just the stories are like the fact that Miss Marvel was written as as an Inhuman instead of a mutant because of the corporate. I mean, we talked about like what I write about is rivalry, and so I've read about corporate rivalry also, but like the story of Scarlet Witch, and Pietro can't be called Pietro in the Fox universe. He's Peter.
Right.
and Scarlet Witch can't be referred to as Scarlet Witch in the MCU. And I don't, did they ever use the name Quicksilver in the MCU
Not
either? I
yet.
don't think
Not yet.
so.
I don't think they can until 25.
And so all of that stuff is just so interesting to me, that like, and it was such a great reveal in that the eighth episode of WandaVision,
Oh my God. So good.
that Agatha then says that makes you the Scarlet Witch. And
Oh yeah.
and to have that reveal by that character, because that was such a popular is such a popular character from that show. It's just really, really interesting. I do want to, because I also want to talk about your theme park fandom a little bit.
Sure.
And then I have some rapid questions for you. So I'm trying to get through it somewhat quickly. But what are some in the MCU right now? What are some prominent queer coded or openly queer characters in the
That's
MCU right now?
that's the problem. Like, this is an actual problem. And there are not enough, or the ones that are there are not represented at all. And I'm like, okay, eventually the X-Men are going to be here, and many of them are gay. So like, do not bring Iceman in here and not make him like dancing at the gay club as he is in the comic books. Like, this is who he is as a character. Uh, so um, what I want to talk about, because I did make some notes about this, is that Loki, for example, is a bisexual character.
Mhm.
And they announced that. And they're like, all the Lokis are bisexual. And it was a big deal. They're like, Loki's the first bisexual character that's
Mhm.
like a hero in the Marvel universe. And I'm like, where? One, where does he say that really explicitly? And secondly, they say that and then immediately like, and here's a girl for
Yeah.
him that's
Yeah.
just himself because he loves himself. And I'm like, I understand that's the story, is that him learning to love himself. But I'm also like, it seems to me that he could be with that other guy, Miles. To me, why you cannot tell me that this character is bisexual and then immediately pair him with the opposite sex.
Yeah.
That tells me the exact opposite of what story you're telling. Then you have America Chavez, who
Mhm.
is gay. She is just a lesbian. That's it. That's our character. And the most we got from that, because there was such a buildup where they were like, we're going to see America Chavez be gay in the MCU. She doesn't reference liking a girl. She doesn't kiss a girl. The most we get is that she has two moms that are immediately sucked up in a portal and we never see them again.
Yeah. And then
Then
she had a pin on her jacket.
yeah,
That was
which
like three instances that
which is very unfortunate for how that character is, where she's just very loudly queer in the
okay.
comic books. And you also have Wanda's children, who, in their defense, I think they're just too young of actors to really be like in the dating scene yet to really show that side of them. But Speed and Wiccan are both queer characters. Speed is bisexual and Wiccan is gay.
Okay.
And whenever we get to Young Avengers, because now we have all the characters in the MCU there to set it up, I think we'll actually see them dive into that. Hopefully, question mark. And then we had Joe Russo playing a gay character for like 2 seconds in Endgame, and he's like, my husband's been missing during the snap and I'm finally seeing someone again. They're like applauding. And I'm like, what is this? Who are these characters? So the only real representations we've had in like the 12, 13 years of the MCU are Nico Minero and Carolina Dean from Runaways, which has been canceled, but they actually let them have a relationship and kiss each other and show that off, which is really important because Runaways was also it's also very queer. Like, it's very queer coded in a lot of ways. And then that we had Fastus from Eternals, which Eternals wasn't received well, not because of that, just because it was just very different thematically from everything else that had been in the MCU. But I actually
hard to tell that story. But
it was hard. I really liked how different it was and just how it took a lot of creative liberties. And I thought that was really cool. And I like how they decided to explore that character's sexuality that way. And I thought that was really cool. But that's it. We haven't gotten any other representation. And a lot of these characters that are in the MCU right now are queer. Like, what's going on with Loki? Like, I want to know when are we going to see that? And when the X-Men come along, I'm like, they cannot do what they've been doing for the past 13 years, where they say this character is queer and then not represent it in any sense of visualizing it on screen. Like it's just not going to work. Um, and I there's just not there's not enough inclusion. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what the deal is. They have gay characters and they are still too afraid to actually show that. And
Yeah.
when is that jump gonna is gonna happen now because of what's going on with the Don't Say Gay bill, and suddenly Marvel and Disney are very willing to showcase a kiss on screen? Is that something we'll be able to see? So I don't know what's going to happen, but we are gearing up for something to happen at this point.
I mean, beyond mere mentions, like
Yeah.
like Valkyrie, it was mentioned in Thor: Love and Thunder. That
Oh yeah, I'm
Valkyrie,
sorry, I forgot. I didn't reference how
that
that
Valkyrie was, like in love, lost her. I don't
Yeah.
know if they were girlfriend, they were married or what, but she lost the love of her life.
Yeah.
But yeah, just mere mentions of that. So next, I think, what are some examples of queer coding, inclusion, or openly queer characters outside in the media, outside of just
Yeah.
Disney? And the first one you have written down, you've already mentioned,
Dr.
but
Frankenfurter.
I mean, it is.
I mean, he's an obvious answer, right?
That
Like,
is that I remember watching that as a kid, and I really like not really knowing what it was, but not really like knowing everything about it, and kind of like, what is it like? Why is um why is this being represented? Because of where I
right.
like was in my life and everything, and I say that the first two you have written down, I whenever I mow or work in the yard, those are two soundtracks that I listen
Oh,
to.
what? So you're referencing Labyrinth next? Is that
Yeah,
the other
yeah.
one?
Those are two that I listen to a lot. I either listen to some type of musical, some type of podcast, or something. And so when you sent over your responses and I saw it, I just was beaming at those. So please give us some examples.
I mean, yeah. I mean, so Jareth from Labyrinth is the one that you're referencing. And both him and Dr. Frankenfurter are kind of gay icons in terms of like these
Yeah.
characters back from the 70s and 80s. Dr. Frankenfurter and all of Rocky Horror Picture Show is very problematic in a lot of ways with modern day, where there's that fight of this is a bad representation
Yeah.
of the trans community, and there's been a lot of back and forth of like, well, should we censor this? And I go, and my answer on this is still no, because of how influential Rocky Horror was for me growing up and figuring out my own sexuality. And like I would be erasing a part of my own personal history, and I feel
Yeah.
like that's
Yeah.
not right for a lot of people, honestly. But he's the very obvious answer, because like, again, they villainized him and they made him the villain, although really was he? I did mention this a little bit. I said Legend of Korra. So Legend of Korra, these are three different things, but Legend of Korra,
Okay.
Steven Universe, and the new She-Ra show from
Yeah.
2018 sort of revolutionized how queer characters are being represented in cartoons. Korra was the first one at the very end to show that she was going into the light with Asami. And it was such a big deal at the time because fans really wanted those characters to be together. But Korra, despite being very butch and masculine, was presented dating men.
Mm-hmm.
And in that final season, they let her be with Asami instead. And it just was such an outpouring of love. And they couldn't directly say it or show a kiss or anything on there. So when the finale aired, the creators immediately afterwards, like, yes, they're together. We just couldn't say that because of the restrictions that we're under, which was really cool of them. And then after that, Steven Universe did go ahead and have two women have a kiss together, like a very long kiss, and then started to reveal that all the characters on that show were gay, like all of them, and Steven himself being a gender fluid character, along with his girlfriend Connie, was like, it just revolutionary. They also did a gay wedding on there. It's just the amount that I bawled over that show, and I do not cry over TV shows or movies. It's just like something that we as the queer community we never had before. And so
Yeah.
they it's a revolutionary show. It's going to be remembered forever. And She-Ra, Princess of Power, again did the same thing, where they took all these old characters from the 80s and they just like made all of them gay. Like just all of them are gay, male or female. There was like two of them that were not. And it was a big change, because these are characters who we, especially with She-Ra, we just assumed like She-Ra and He-Man characters were kind of queer, but to outwardly say that was a big change. And then you have characters like Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn, who in the 90s were insinuated through queer coding that they were possibly together. And now at this point, canonically are one of the most famous queer couples together. But then if you look back, if you look beyond comic books, we're talking about comic books and modern animation, but if you look back, there are classic characters that have always represented queerness over the years. Top of the list is Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny is one of the queerest characters I've ever looked to. He's gender fluid. He'll put on tux or a dress. And how many times has he kissed Elmer Fudd? Like how many times, right? You know, he has been written that way. And so it's mind-boggling to me when somebody that is super conservative will be like, we need to go back to what animation was when we were kids with Looney Tunes. I was like, that was even more queer than we're giving you now. Like, what are you telling me?
Well, and that's real quick. That's also, it's so interesting. The like Looney Tunes was basically almost like it was like it's not a mirror. It was a grittier Fab Five for
Yeah,
Disney.
right.
You know, really a lot of the people who created Looney Tunes used to work for the Walt Disney Company. And so you have like these characters that, I mean, you know, some of them are pretty clear, like with Daffy Duck and Donald Duck, but like it was meant to be grittier, and meant to be more irreverent. So I just wanted to throw that one in there.
No, you're right. I mean, they were both, and both Disney and Looney Tunes were releasing a lot of questionable cartoons at that time too. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. And like, it just, I think that's why for a long time I was very stuck on Looney Tunes growing up, is that they just had all these characters that like I related to, like Tom and Jerry is another one. Mm-hmm. Like, what is their deal even? It's supposed to be a cat and mouse thing, but they keep on winding up in bed together. Like, I don't know what that's about. But more prominent, like Bert and Ernie, like I think they are like the most famous ones that people think are gay together. And they still haven't been outed that way, even though almost every single writer has come out and said like, no, they're gay. Yeah. Frank Oz said that, no, they're not gay because they're puppets. How could they even have a sexuality? But that in itself also doesn't work, because Gonzo exists, and Gonzo is always referred to as like a whatever, because again, he was being queer coded in the sense that they couldn't say that he was gay, but he's the one that's always doing the drag. He's the one who recently in the new Muppet Babies wanted to be a princess, and they did a whole episode about how it's not okay to just assume that only the girls can do that.
We actually watched the new Muppet Babies.
Oh, did you?
A lot. That's basically on repeat. One thing about Gonzo though, and I asked somebody else who's spoken in the class before, I always thought Gonzo represented free love, which I guess,
same thing. Yeah, right.
I guess because of the chickens that would follow him around.
Yeah, right.
But then as you're saying this, it is like, okay, well, yeah, it's not. There's not another. No one knows what a Gonzo is, but there's not another Gonzo. It is like this different, I guess, species that he is attracted to. So when I saw that on the list, that one stuck out to me also as really
that's good
interesting.
though. That is good. I mean, right now I'm actually doing a whole Muppets rewatch of like all their movies and TV shows, because I haven't seen them in forever, and really how ahead of their time they are and how inventive they are just really incredible. But I've been definitely finding myself a big Gonzo lover. like I just did not catch on to that when I was a kid, but like as an adult, I feel like he is so incredible. I also understand Miss Piggy and why the gay community love her, because she's just like this fierce woman. So but a couple other mentions I'm gonna make here, just for sort of the younger crowds. We have Team Rocket from Pokemon, who very traditionally, at least 30 years ago, were being depicted as these two people that were always like switching gender roles all the time, and that they were like best friends. They weren't in a relationship. They were a man and a woman wearing the opposite gender's clothing all the time. And they are huge within the gay community. Like back when I used to do cosplay, I cosplayed James all the time. He was
Okay.
such a great character to be because like I understood him. And Powerpuff Girls also had a character named Him who was
Okay.
very Mr. Sinister, very Dr. Frankenfurter, where it's
Hmm.
like very gender fluid character. So I mean, these characters exist everywhere in modern society, and like in the most like obvious ways. Like I think saying like we all grew up with Sesame Street, and like Bert and Ernie are like very, very queer coded.
Hmm.
And you could say, yeah, they're just really close friends that sometimes share a bed. And it's like, yeah, straight men can be allowed to have that. And I don't want to erase that either, because I feel like that often gets looked over where it's like, well, no, straight men can still have that kind of friendship and
Hmm.
bond without it being a gay thing. That's allowed. And I think that creates a lot of discourse, especially for men that are not trying to figure that out. Like I think that's a point of discourse for them where it's like, is it uncomfortable for them to have that friendship without it being a gay thing, or is it a gay thing for
Yeah.
them? And
Yeah.
I think Bert and Ernie also walk that line very frequently, although it's kind of hard to say that because they're both very queer acting all the time. So it's very different with them. But
Yeah.
these characters have always been around.
It's interesting with Sesame Street because and I don't know, I may my history of Sesame Street may be off, but it seems they have been more willing to be inclusive
Oh, well,
and
absolutely.
quicker than a lot of, I mean, you
For
look at,
decades, honestly.
yeah, I mean, and you look at the number of characters that they introduce that basically look at their, they look at their fan base, they look at their viewers,
Yeah.
and they try to represent those. And so it is interesting that hasn't been represented so far. So
Oh no, don't
oh,
die.
excuse me. The last thing I want to talk about before some of the rapid fire
Yeah, go
is
for it.
your YouTube channel.
Oh yeah, sure.
Um Ryan Pagella's Theme Parks and Adventures.
Yeah.
Um and so tell us a little bit about that, how you like what you do. You go to different theme parks, is it based primarily on one brand or what?
No, it's not one brand. I mean, there's a lot of Disney on there for when I go to Disney. I spend a lot of time at Six Flags and also some local parks around here. But I also go beyond theme parks. I just find fun things to do. So, um, as we discussed at the beginning of this episode, I fell in love with Disney and theme parks in my teens, and a lot of it is actually it's a combination of me loving thrill rides and also loving the history of theme parks and just what was considered like a big deal, like how a carousel for like I've seen 90 people that are like 95 get onto the carousel and turn like into the
Yeah.
a 10-year-old
Yeah.
again. And what theme parks do to people, especially Disney. And I'd even mentioned this earlier, but my whole family, we're a very creative family. My mom owned a dance studio for over 30 years, and we were all involved with doing her annual recital in
Okay.
any show. And we all had a different role. Um, and so I come from a very theatrical background. Like our whole family is in the arts and in theater. And we what my mom prided herself on was having things being very technically sound, like not perfect, but very immersive and technically sound.
Mhm.
And when we went to Disney World, seeing that on a level where like the audience then becomes part of that really changed how I then directed shows, because I directed shows for like 8, 9 years. Like I was
Yeah.
doing rapid fire plays all the time. And like the way that I would do it is I would take it from the Disney angle. And so, like going into theme parks, I want that theming. And like that's what I'm looking for and look for on the channel. But I'm also very much about what I said at the beginning of this episode, or this class, I should say, uh, is mental health, being positive, and breaking away from like the idea of being negative, and that the only thing that gets in our way of ourselves is ourselves. And
Mhm.
on the channel, I spend a lot of time with that. And I try not to fall too much down in the nostalgia spiral, because I think there's two things of living your youth and your adult life where you can still be energetic and have that energy, versus just falling down a nostalgia hole of like,
Mhm.
this reminds me of my childhood. And they're two very different things. And you know I used to be a very big drinker. I drink very, very, very minimally now. Like, I actually went like a year and a half without a drink until recently, just because I feel like I don't need it. I don't
Hmm.
want it. And I used to be, like, I used to party like everybody else does. I'm sure some of your students do if they're 21. But, you know, uh, I want to show people that you can have a good time without that, and how to have that good time, and how adventure is everywhere, how what Disney is presenting to us, and they're really top tier in embracing that side of yourself. Because yeah, we're bringing kids to Disney, but it's funny because I feel like there's so many more adults going to Disney World and
Yeah.
having these like moments which are beyond nostalgia. They're just allowing themselves to be happy and adventurous and energetic. And I'm not saying that we as adults want to give up responsibility, because I think that's what makes us adults and allows us to have the things that we have and want in our life. But we give up such a piece of ourselves unless you have children. And I think a lot of time people have children to experience this again, is like that youthfulness, that
Hmm.
sense of adventure and doing something new, and like embracing the moment. Like, I think a lot about my teens when I go to theme parks is we just go do whatever. We just went with the flow. And we get so bogged down by responsibility as adults,
Hmm.
and what we think we have to do. And yes, we have responsibility, but like, you got to let go, do something fun. And I feel like going to the theme parks really embraces that, and just the overall vibe of my channel. So even if we don't go to a theme park, I'll be like, we're going to the beach and this is what we're exploring today. I've never been here. Or we're doing this escape room. Like, we're doing something new
Hmm.
and adventurous. And I'm doing it without alcohol, because I think that's the other way people reach that, is by
Yeah.
drinking. Um, and I'm not saying you don't need to drink. I know Disney does some incredible experiences with, especially over at Epcot, with their whole
Yeah. Food and
drink
wine
over. Yeah, I mean,
festival.
like,
Yeah.
it's hard to say no to that, but like, that we have the ability to do that at any age. And that the thing that happens to many of us, is that we lose the desire and drive to do those things the older we get, because we fall into patterns that are everyday patterns. And many people have families, and that becomes their life too. And I'm not judging that at all, because all my friends have children. um, and they do live through their children. But then what happens is that a lot of those people then get to their 50s, and their kids have moved out to college, and they don't even know what to do with themselves, because they've
Yeah.
lost that
Yeah.
piece of themselves. And Disney pushes for you to embrace that piece of yourself all the time, and be like, it hits it on the nose, where they're like, you go to Disney and the magic's still alive. Like, it's
Yeah.
a magical experience, because they have found a way to tap into people's psyches and make things a magical experience. And I tried to find Disney's magical experience wherever I go. And that's what I push for, because like, we had that in our youth,
Hmm.
we had that in our teens, and then we lose it as we get older. But it's only something that we've given up in order to continue on forward, because we think we can't have both things, which
Yeah.
is absolutely not true.
Yeah.
And you can have families and really experience that with your family, and also have that individually as yourself. So yeah, you're doing it with your kids, but also you can go and be like, today I'm not with my kids. Today I'm just doing this for myself, and I'm still going to have the adventure. And then I'm also going to have this adventure with my kids. And I may not have children myself, so I don't know exactly how that feeling works, but I do have a dog that I feel very separated from. And like, well, sometimes I go to the beach by myself, and I'm like, oh, I wish I'd brought my dog with me. And I'm like, don't feel guilty about this, Ryan. This is you having your moment without her. And it's okay. You can have both things. And it's just something we kind of give up. And with
Yeah.
the vlog, I want everyone of all ages to experience just being alive, and positivity, and how far just being in that mindset changes things. And using theme parks absolutely accesses that, because I mean, we're challenging our fears, number one, because we're going on terrifying rides half the time, but also like, we're putting ourselves in a place where it's heavily themed, and it's trying to create a magical moment for you.
Yeah.
And at some point I plan to move to the Orlando area and just have Disney and Universal all the time, because I like that stuff. And you know the magic is calling.
Hmm.
Like, that's just how it goes.
Yeah.
So
Well,
uh
I'm glad you talked about that, because I mean, the overall takeaway from this class is, if you are a fan of something and it doesn't hurt someone else, there are things that people are fans of that significantly hurt other people, that you should not do those. But if you're a fan of something and it doesn't hurt someone else, that's generally a good thing, to be a
Yeah.
fan of that, to show your fandom, because it makes you happier. It makes you a more, rounded person. And from a societal perspective, when you're happier, it makes you more, a more productive member of society as well.
A more participant person
Yeah,
of
yeah.
society, right?
And I really like, I have been to the parks when I was younger and even as an adult before we had kids.
Yeah.
And I've been with my kids. I have been one time since my kids have been born, and I went by
Okay.
myself, but I was there on a conference. And it's this weird, like, it's this weird dichotomy. Like, you're so excited, and then you have so much guilt also. That, like, so
Yeah, right.
I think the way that I worked through that is, like, I am not a person who like vlogs or does any of that. But I did get out my phone and I would take it on rides and stuff, and I would,
Yeah.
but like, I would be very quiet at the end, like, I love you boys, because I didn't want to, like, I didn't,
Yeah.
I don't know if I didn't want to interrupt other people's experiences, or maybe if there was a part of me that I didn't want other people to know that I was doing that. I don't know. But
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun to go and experience. And it is, like, I could say, as someone who is a father, when you go with your kids, there are new experiences. Like, I still get very emotional when I walk in to town square.
Yeah.
And then obviously when you turn and you see the castle.
Yeah.
But, like, that is still an emotional experience for me. It's still emotional when I first drive onto property.
Oh God, same.
Um
Every time.
it I mean, I remember going in 2012, and that had been the first time I had been back in 15 years, or maybe even 20 years.
Yeah.
And driving up to, we were on the bus, driving to Disney Springs and driving past that sign that's now unfortunately either being
Uh
removed or has been removed, and just, like, tearing up the whole
yeah.
time. Um, and I remember, like, I took my wife, who I said we were dating at the time, and, halfway, or when we got off the Haunted Mansion, she's like, "Okay, I get it now. Like,
Yeah.
I get why Disney's different than
Yeah.
other places." And taking the boys, and, like, now both boys are really into roller coasters. So
How
we'll
old are older are they now?
5 and 7.
Okay.
So hopefully I
Yeah.
still will have some years in me that I'll still be good with roller coasters.
You'll be good with
Um,
the ones at Disney because they're not super intense. So you're
yeah.
fine.
So, like, you remember things like, my oldest son going on Slinky Dog Dash, and that was his
Yeah.
first roller coaster. And then my youngest son, one of the best memories of him being there was the first year he went, and he was too young to ride Splash Mountain.
Oh yeah.
So my wife took the oldest, and uh, her father was with them.
Okay.
And so one set of grandparents, and they went to Splash Mountain, and the youngest and I just went, and we watched Country Bear Jamboree
I
like
love
4 or 5 times in a row.
Okay, I love that you guys did that because I'm obsessed with the Country Bear
Yeah,
Jamboree.
like like we would leave, and this is I think this is what he held on to for so long. We would leave, get snacks, go back in and watch. Leave, get snacks, go back in and watch. So I think, like, he
Yeah.
he really liked the snacks part. But he thinks of Country Bear Jamboree as a musical now. If you ask him his favorite musical, Country Bear Jamboree is, and, like,
That's
his,
really funny.
yeah. Um
Have you shown him the movie?
so
I
he
love
has
that movie and it's
watched,
so stupid and I love it so much.
I think he has made it through a third of the movie. I
Okay, all
like the
right.
movie
I
just
I do
because
too.
of Country Bear Jamboree.
I
But
think it's funny. I
yeah, um he did not make it through the movie, and
Okay.
so what I want to close with is, we do some rapid questions in this class.
Okay.
Um, and the first, they're phrased in a way that you can explain, You don't have to explain it all. It's up to
These
you.
are fun. I like this. It's already
Um,
we do this on the
so
Mutant Ages all the time when listeners write into us, and they're
yeah.
my favorite thing to do.
The first one is students in the class, as I told you, do a project where they research an MCU or Marvel character
Yep.
and they identify, excuse me, a character or characters that they most closely relate to. And the purpose of the um, assignment is that, what are the attributes that you like about this person,
Yep.
and how can they help you move forward? So that's the first question. What MCU character or characters, and it could be Marvel, broader Marvel, do you most closely identify with, and why?
So we're doing Marvel, not Disney. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, Marvel.
Okay. Marvel.
Well, Marvel MCU, like, so it could be the MCU, could be the Fox, Netflix, all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Netflix. Oh, right, because they were on Netflix for a
yeah,
while.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. This is a tough one because a lot of my characters are X-Men characters. So I'll try to do my best here. But for the comic books, I can tell you right now, I love Jubilee. I've
Okay.
been asked on our show which character I'm most like, and we've decided it's Jubilee. I know that it's very strange because we watched the X-Men the animated series again, and there were many people that have said that Jubilee is bad on that show, but I think it's just racism because she's Asian, and she seemed totally fine to me. But she and I are the same. We were both skipping school together, playing at the arcade. We're both very sassy and punk, and kind of nerdy. We both play video games, like, but also very loud about where we stand
Mm-hmm.
politically. And we're always having a lot of fun. And if there's somebody that's going to go to a theme park of all the Marvel characters, it's going to be Jubilee.
Yeah.
She's the one that wants to go do that stuff. She would be on the same track as I am. She would be starting a podcast about whatever and be doing her whole YouTube thing. That's just who she is. So I've always looked to her, but maybe it's also just like a generational thing because when I was consuming X-Men, like she was the teenager character. So like
Okay.
I relate a lot to her, but also 80s, 90s kid, and that's who she was. So that's like my comic book answer.
Okay.
MCU is a little bit more challenging because they haven't introduced the X-Men yet. So I'm thinking on this now. There's characters I like. There's like characters I think are cool, but I don't feel like I relate to them yet. I love Wanda. I don't feel like I'm as like my mental health is a lot better than Wanda's is. Like I feel like that is a hard answer to give you because there's just like again, maybe it goes back to that we haven't had the representation that I've needed in the MCU. And I'm just like going through all the movies in my head and like what characters. There's so many characters I like, but I haven't been like, that's my character. That's the one that I could do over and over again. Like I have a friend that is basically Tony Stark in real life. And
Okay.
so like I always turn, and it's a girl too. She's very masculine presenting. And I'm always like, you are Tony Stark. Like I cannot compete with you on that. So I guess my answer right now is for comic wise Jubilee or maybe Nightcrawler because he's very extroverted and like he's always performing, and I love Nightcrawler, although I don't have like the church hang-ups that he does. And Iceman's another character that I feel very related to. So again, these are characters that haven't been presented in the MCU yet, and I'm like, give me those MCU characters. That's what I was asking. I'm like, do we have Disney as an option?
Well, what Disney character do you most identify with?
So ironically, as much as I love the villains, it's not a villain. I got two answers here. So the first one is Stitch from Lilo and Stitch.
Okay.
He is all over my apartment, everywhere. And he's actually huge in the LGBTQ community because the whole movie is just about like acceptance and found family. And I don't know, I love Stitch. He's the outsider that learns how to like I was the outsider for many years. Like I didn't have a lot of friends growing up until I hit high school, and I had to learn how to talk to people because I just did not have that social skill, which is very strange because I'm such an extrovert now. And I feel like that's Stitch's journey. Stitch is the outsider who came in. He's the weirdo. Everyone thought he was the weirdo. He doesn't know how to talk to anyone or like get along with anyone, and he makes a lot of mistakes that hurts people. And that was kind of like my teenage years where I was trying to figure that out. Um, and it's, just becoming into my own, and accepting my own weirdness, and having my found family of friends. And I have a really good family too, but like, I found family of other queer kids that I hung out with, like, and I just always found that relatable. The other character that is more recent is that I've just really taken a liking to Moana.
Okay.
And I think her journey of being told repeatedly that this is what you're going to do in your life and this is your role, and pushing against it and be like, no, there's a greater calling for me out of the ocean, something that's far more adventurous. And I have a love for my people and my family and my friends, but that there's something beyond all that I'm meant for. And I want to embrace that adventure, is something that calls to me, and is a big part of that film. And that she herself pushes against it and hits all the same like hurdles that I have hit, and pushing forward with like my career and what I want in my life, and people telling me, no, you can't have that because A, B, and C, and be like, no, I'm listening to my inner calling. I'm listening to what the water is saying to me.
Okay.
And she's a beach girl. I'm a beach girl too. So like, I feel that.
Favorite Disney park?
Hollywood Studios.
Okay.
You were talking about getting emotional for Magic Kingdom. I walk through the gates of Hollywood Studios, and I have to hold back getting teary-eyed, because I love walking down Hollywood Boulevard and Sunset Boulevard. I love seeing the Tower of Terror and looking right over that. I love the Rock and Roller Coaster. Something about the Tower of Terror just like gets me every time. And they have the Muppets there. Now they have Galaxy's Edge and Toy Story, which are like how could you deny that? So
yeah.
There you go.
Favorite Disney ride?
Oh, come on. There's so many good ones. Okay, so it's like somewhere between Haunted Mansion and Tower of Terror, because when we go to Magic Kingdom, I beeline it for, this is how we don't get on the Jungle Cruise, because the only way you get on that is if you go there first.
Yeah,
and I
that's
have
the very
to go,
first thing you go.
No, I have to start my day every single time with Haunted Mansion, every single time. And Tower of Terror, same thing. And a big shout out to Rock and Roller Coaster, which I still think is the best launch coaster that we have out there right now. So
the first one I go to is actually Peter Pan, because
really,
if you're not there, you're waiting an hour and a half to get on.
That's true.
Favorite restaurant anywhere on Disney property?
Oh, this is a good one, because I think they're all really good and really interesting to know. Every single time I go, I try to do something new. I still love Ohana. I think Ohana was, and I know they serve dinner, and I haven't done the dinner one yet. But have you done the breakfast buffet there? Because
no, I haven't been there at all yet.
Oh my God. Well, first of all, the Polynesian Resort is one of the most beautiful resorts they have on property. But you go in, and they do character meet and greets with like Tropical Mickey and Minnie, and then they have Stitch and Lilo there. And it's like one of those character and greet restaurants, but they do a family styled breakfast where everybody pays like a flat fee of like $50 or whatever. And they bring you like this giant pan of food as like every possible breakfast food in there.
Yeah.
But it's like the best breakfast food I've ever eaten. And the concept behind it is that you're having, because Ohana means family, you're having a family styled meal. Yeah. And it's very emotional, and it's very delicious. And I don't know, I want to check out the dinner scene and what they do there, but it's awesome.
Yeah. What about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying anything.
Hotel on property. Is it Polynesian?
I haven't stayed there yet, and I really, really want to. I feel like that will be my answer, but of all the places that I've stayed so far, even though it's one of their budget hotels, I love the Art of Animation. I think
yeah. We stayed there this last time.
Yeah.
And we stayed in a car suite. It's awesome. But also anything on the Skyliner is like that. I look for hotels on the Skyliner because it is such a cool experience.
Yeah.
To like get on that, and it's so awesome.
And sometimes faster than waiting for the shuttle. So
yeah. All right, two more. Favorite Disney treat?
Ooh, okay. This is fun. So this is fun fact, I have both a dairy and a peanut allergy. So like all those fun ice cream things
Yeah.
they do, they are not dairy friendly there, and it's really annoying and very frustrating. Um, so usually there's two things I always get when I'm at Disney. One, the Mickey pretzel, because how could you not get a Mickey pretzel? And then two, in the hotels, I always get some sort of cupcake. Because I can have dairy if it's been cooked into something. And those are my two go-tos every single time.
Um, and then the last one. What is the what's the next X-Men character you want to see introduced into the MCU?
I guess like the first X-Men character, besides Miss Marvel. That's I think I what they're gonna probably do is do Xavier and Magneto,
Yeah.
um, or Wolverine. I think that's what they're gonna do. And of those characters, I think the one I fantasize most about is seeing Magneto show up in a post-credit scene, because there's plenty of opportunities. Um, just waiting for him to walk on in and tell Wanda that he's her father. I'm
Yeah.
just waiting
Yeah.
for that moment. That's what I want. And also, Magneto is probably my favorite X-Men character. So
Okay. All right.
I want to
Well,
see him.
Ryan, thank you for this.
Yeah,
And
of course.
you've stayed past when I originally said, so I appreciate that.
Well, you know what? To be fair, we had some technical difficulties, so it took some time to actually start.
So this was so awesome. It's such a interesting and important topic that
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming by. For anybody in the class or who is listening that wants to either follow you or listen to what you're doing, what's the best ways to do that?
Well, you can find me personally on Twitter at Ryan Pagella and on Instagram at Ryan.Pagella. My podcast is The Mutant Ages. You can go to themutantages.com. You can just type it into any podcast listening software you have. We're everywhere. We're even on Spotify. And if you want to follow my YouTube channel, it's my name, Ryan Pagella. You can just type that in. It will bring up the Ryan Pagella Theme
Okay.
Park and Adventures.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for this.
Well, thank
And
you.
this was so much fun. Have a
Yeah.
great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you for having me on.
Bye.
Bye.